You don't know One Piece until you've seen the iceberg. Most One Piece fans think they know One Piece, to which I say no, you don't, because the version of this story living in iceberg charts is a completely different manga that you've only seen in screenshots and cursed Reddit threads. You know the big moments, the gear reveals, the crying panels, sure. But you probably don't know the island that existed for exactly one panel before Oda quietly erased it from the map. Or the background. Nobody who secretly has a fully canon war-torn backstory. Here's an interesting thing about internet culture. When people get obsessed with a series, they don't just make tier lists. They build icebergs, layered charts where the top is stuff your grandma knows from anime clips, and the bottom is where you find scrapped devil fruits, void century meta lore, and theories built on a single blurry background panel from 1998. And as far as anime goes, One Piece has some of the most detailed, unhinged, beautifully over-engineered icebergs anyone has ever made. People like to say, "Oh yeah, I've seen the One Piece Iceberg," as if there's just one definitive version, because of course this fandom turned it into a whole power system of its own. To which I say, which one? The 5-tier meme with Buggy is strong at the top? The 20-layer monstrosity that cites half-forgotten 2CH posts from 2003? This video is not us just reading one JPEG like it's the will of D. We're doing a synthesis run. I want to emphasize what that actually means. We pulled from multiple fan-made charts, SBS answers, Vivre cards, databooks, interviews, convention comments, and those vague forum arguments you only remember at 3 a.m. The goal is to turn this mess into a coherent narrative, starting from light surface trivia and slowly sliding down into implied genocides, government black ops, and child experimentation that Oda kind of just leaves in the background while Luffy is doing funny faces. Structurally, this whole project is 52 sections. This first chunk is our opening 15 layers of Frostbite. We're starting with the origins of the iceberg meme in the fandom, the early series mysteries from East Blue, and the Romance Dawn prototypes, and the first hints that Oda's world-building is way more unstable, retconned, and conspiratorial than the anime edit wants you to believe. And to be fair, it still has to function as a shonen about rubber pirates punching dragons, but underneath that is a very different, much weirder story. The central idea here is that the One Piece Iceberg isn't just trivia. It's a map of how fans reverse-engineer Oda's brain. Every pattern, every contradiction, every "wait, that island shouldn't be there on the map," becomes evidence in a decades-long group project. He probably never expected anyone to track this obsessively. Later on, we're going to hit pre-serialization drafts, scrapped devil fruits that got recycled into other characters, void century meta-lore buried in a single SBS line, and theories that hinge on one background newspaper headline. But before we dive that deep, we have to start at the very first tier, because even the most basic layer of the iceberg already quietly rewrites how you think about East Blue, about Romance Dawn, and about what kind of story One Piece was supposed to be in the first place. So, let's start at the top of the iceberg and watch how fast the water gets dark. From meme to map, how the One Piece Iceberg was born. So how did we end up here staring at a giant chart that looks like a conspiracy board drawn by a sleep-deprived cartographer with a devil fruit addiction? The answer is that the iceberg meme itself is kind of the final evolution of guy who makes tier lists instead of touching grass. It started in creepypasta and gaming circles with Mario Iceberg and Minecraft Iceberg charts, cataloging rumors, lost builds, and haunted ROMs. and then just migrated everywhere. Because as far as the internet is concerned, everything eventually becomes a tier list or an iceberg. Anime got in on it fast. You had general anime iceberg memes, then specific ones for Naruto, Evangelion, whatever. The format is simple power. Top is stuff your cousin knows. The bottom is things only 3 people on an image board remember. One Piece was basically genetically engineered for this. Too long, too dense, way too many data books. Of course, someone, somewhere on Reddit, was going to go, what if we stack all the weird facts in vertical suffering order? The first notable One Piece icebergs were tiny, messy images on Reddit and Twitter, and even older ones on /a/ and /v/. They'd throw Gear second and Shanks is a Yonko on the surface, then immediately dive into this background, Marine has a canon name in a Vivre card, or Oda once drew Luffy with a gun in an early Romance Dawn draft. You'd get SBS-only jokes like Zoro's favorite alcohol brand sitting right next to that one data book-only character age that breaks the timeline. And to be fair, that tonal whiplash was part of the charm. But here's an interesting thing. Very quickly, people realized they weren't all making the same iceberg. One chart was pure power-scaling mysteries like, what is Imu's ability? And is Shanks secretly a celestial dragon? Another was just dark theories, child soldiers, genocide, Mary Joyce, slavery, logistics. A third was trivia hell, obsessed with cover story islands and exhibition-only maps. So fans started stitching them together into mega icebergs, Frankensteining every version into one overwhelming map of things you probably shouldn't try to explain in one sitting, to which I say, obviously we're going to try. Once YouTubers and wiki editors got involved, the iceberg stopped being a joke image and quietly turned into a to-do list. Channels would pull up a chart and go tier by tier. Forums would argue placements. Wikis would create pages just to fill gaps. That created a feedback loop. Every time someone dug up a new Oda interview, or some obscure exhibition pamphlet with a new island name, updated icebergs appeared overnight. Which is where this gets interesting as an actual lore framework, because One Piece doesn't just have canon and filler, it has a whole layered system of sources. You've got the manga, the anime, SBSQ and AS, Vivre card databooks, cover stories, one-off Oda comments, even museum exhibits with exclusive maps. The iceberg became a way to stack all of that. Surface tiers are manga only. Deeper tiers are paracanon and metalore that probably wasn't meant to be cross-examined this hard. Over time, the tone shifted. Early charts were like, did you know Enel is on the moon? Later ones went, did you know this island implies a war crime we never see on panel? Suddenly, the bottom tiers were full of child experimentation, erased kingdoms, geography that doesn't line up, and the vague dread that Oda's timeline is held together with duct tape and vibes. I want to emphasize, that's not a criticism, that's the fun. Our approach in this video is not to swear loyalty to any single cursed PNG. We're using the iceberg as a spine, but we're going to group related entries into coherent zones instead of just jumping from Buggy's nose to global genocide in one breath. We'll start at the so-called safe surface layer, East Blue, Romance Dawn, the early drafts, and watch how quickly even that tier gets weird. Because the top of the iceberg, it's already hiding prototype Straw Hats, scrapped deaths, and a version of One Piece that almost went a very different way. Surface level, the everyone knows this tier. That's already wrong. So let's stand on the nice, safe tip of the iceberg, where everybody nods along like, yeah, Void Century, Joy Boy, Will of D, Ancient Weapons, Corrupt World Government. We got it. This is the One Piece starter pack, right? To which I say, that's not understanding. That's reading the back of the box. Because as far as surface tier entries go, these are less solved mysteries and more like marketing bullet points Oda dangles in front of us. We all talk about the Void Century existing, Joy Boy being important, the Will of D meaning inherited will, the ancient weapons being world-ending superweapons, and the world government being cartoonishly evil. And to be fair, those are all technically true. They're just also incredibly vague, frequently contradictory, and almost always filtered through characters who absolutely do not have the full picture. Take the Void Century. Everyone knows it's a lost 100 years erased by the world government after the fall of an ancient kingdom. Sounds clean, right? Except we're weirdly fuzzy on the exact dates, what was actually recorded, and who remembers what. Clover's speech is cut off. The Roger Pirate's knowledge is implied, but never quoted. Even O'Hara's research is reconstructed secondhand through Robin and the Buster Call aftermath. We talk about it like there's a neat Wikipedia article somewhere, when it's actually a mess of half-statements and redacted history. Here's an interesting thing. Most of the time someone explains the Void Century. It's either interrupted, censored, or wrapped in metaphor. That's not lore. That's Oda waving a "do not trust this" flag. Same deal with Joy Boy, and the Will of D Joy Boy is important, because people keep saying he's important. The Will of D is the storm that will one day engulf the world, which sounds cool and power system-y until you realize it's literally a guy with a middle initial and a dream. We fill in the gaps with fanon and then treat that fanon as canon. And anime-only shaping makes this worse. Filler arcs, extended flashbacks, and toei pacing stretch these ideas until they feel way more concrete than they are in the manga. An ominous line that takes one panel on the page becomes a full minute of zoom-ins, reaction shots, and dramatic music. After 20 years of that, who wouldn't come away thinking the timeline and geography are crystal clear? Icebergs also love to park early series stuff like East Blue, Romance Dawn, and Logtown right at the top, as if those are the simple zones. But that early material is where Oda hid a ton of prototypes, quiet retcons, and contradictions he later papered over. I want to emphasize this. The supposed safe layer is where the story is still mutating. Luffy's power, the tone of the Marines, even how the Grand Line is described, are all wobblier than the fandom usually admits. So, part of this video's mission is to reshuffle the tiers. Some allegedly deep entries turn out to be straightforward once you trace every canon source. Some, everyone knows this, facts collapse the second you ask, who actually said that? For each iceberg layer, we'll hit 3 steps. What fans think it means, what the manga and side material actually say, and where the gaps or cursed implications live. And if the surface is already this unstable, what happens when we rewind before Chapter 1, back to the multiple Romance Dawn prototypes, and the version of One Piece that existed before Luffy ever set sail from Fuchsia Village? Before Chapter 1, The Many Faces of Romance Dawn. So before we even get to Chapter 1, One Piece is already a multiverse. Not in the Marvel sense, in the Oda turned in 3 different pilots and Jump just let him cook sense. Romance Dawn isn't one thing. It's a small cluster of proto-One Piece timelines. You've got the original one-shot in Weekly Shonen Jump 96, the version in the '97 special, and then the final manga Chapter 1 that we all know. Same core idea. Rubber Kid, Straw Hat, wants to be Pirate King. But when you actually read them back to back, it feels like you're watching the world snap into focus across alternate drafts. Here's an interesting thing. Almost every major pillar of the story has a weird, slightly off-brand version hiding in these pilots. Luffy's mentor figure isn't quite Shanks yet. In one version, it's this wandering grandpa-ish pirate. In another, it leans harder into a straight-up kindly old man archetype. The Navy shows up, but it's treated more like generic government soldiers than the ideological machine we get later. Even the devil fruit system is looser. The gum-gum fruit is already here, but the rules are vaguer, the drawbacks are fuzzier, and it reads more like fun cartoon power than a cog in a global power system tied to history, bloodlines, and certain drums. People like to say, it's just prototypes, who cares? To which I say, you care, because as far as iceberg charts go, Romance Dawn is basically the Mariana Trench of metalore. These drafts are Oda's sketchbook on paper. You can literally watch him test drive character archetypes that he'll later slice up and redistribute. That early grandpa pirate energy? It gets recycled into Garp, into Rayleigh, even a bit into Whitebeard's whole Oyaji thing. The more heroic, almost storybook pirates, and the softer, less terrifying Navy feel like they got split into the Revolutionary Army on one side and the darker world government on the other. I want to emphasize how different Luffy's emotional wiring feels. His relationship with that grandfather figure is much more direct and sentimental, less chaotic than Garp yeeting him into ravines. The gum-gum fruit is treated as a quirky gift, not a cosmic anomaly with secret naming conventions. And the tone of piracy swings wildly. In one version, pirates are basically adventurous neighbors. In another, they're closer to bandits with boats. You can see Oda trying to calibrate how scary this world is allowed to be. And fans, being the healthy, well-adjusted people we are, mind this for every scrap of meta lore. Those vague mentions of different sea regions and sky realms? People connect them to later sky islands, to the New World's fragmented politics, to how the Revolutionary Army operates in the cracks. Early throwaway pirate factions get mapped onto Yonko crews, or theorized as lost prototypes for sword and cipher pole divisions. Canon-wise, Oda's been clear. Romance Dawn is prototype, not parallel universe. And to be fair, he also keeps raiding that prototype like a long-term savings account. So the line between non-canon draft and accidental foreshadowing is a mess, which is exactly why Iceberg makers drop entries like Romance Dawn Luffy and Prototype Shanks near the surface, but then drag the implications, especially the early, softer government, way deeper, because some of those inconsistencies didn't stay in the drawer. A few slipped into East Blue itself, and once the world blew up in scale, Oda had to quietly retcon, bury, or weaponize them, which is where the iceberg starts getting a lot colder. East Blue isn't stable, early arc retcons, and quiet fixes. And nowhere is that colder than East Blue, which fandom loves to treat as this cozy tutorial sea where nothing really matters. To which I say, East Blue is a crime scene. It just hides the body under nostalgia and the anime's 4:3 aspect ratio. Because as far as structure goes, East Blue looks clean. You meet Luffy, you collect some guys, you punch some local tyrants, and then you go to the real story. But if you actually zoom in, it's a patchwork of half-formed ideas that Oda later upgrades, downgrades, or quietly shoves behind a curtain. The iceberg calls this stuff East Blue inconsistencies and parks it in the middle tiers, but those little cracks end up warping the whole global map. Take power scaling. Early on, Captain Morgan is staged like a mini-final boss. Don Krieg shows up as the strongest man of East Blue, with a fleet and gas and armor, and everyone is trembling like this guy is endgame content. Then Arlong walks in, and suddenly Krieg feels like a side quest you accidentally did at level 50. Fast forward to the Grand Line, and all of them are speed bumps. It's not just natural escalation, it's Oda retroactively deciding what strong even means in this system. Here's an interesting thing. Zoro's steel problem. In East Blue, I can't cut steel is treated as a hard wall, a whole character hurdle. Later, we get flashbacks and cursed sword lore, and a swordsman culture where cutting steel is basically step one on the job application. You can reconcile it as Zoro's mindset, and to be fair, that's probably what Oda wants now, but you can feel the retcon smoothing over an older, simpler idea of sword power. Devil fruits and sea stone are the same kind of mess. Early devil fruit talk is vague. They're rare, mysterious, and the Marines don't feel optimized around them at all. Sea stone shows up as this weird Kairoseki handcuff gimmick, not the industrial super material we see later in ships, prisons, and entire rail systems. Bounties and Marine response times are also all over the place. Luffy racks up a huge bounty off relatively local chaos, while later world-shaking events sometimes get slower or oddly calibrated reactions. Geography-wise, East Blue might as well be a kiddie pool. Travel times flex wildly, depending on drama needs. Currents barely exist, and islands feel like they're arranged off-screen with a shuffle button. Then we hit the Grand Line and New World, and suddenly we have log poses, magnetic fields, and fixed routes. That's why fan-made global maps never quite line up. They're trying to weld an early storybook ocean onto a later, more rigid navigation puzzle. So, how does Oda fix it? Not by loudly apologizing, but by death by 1,000 clarifications. SBS answers reframe early Marines as weak branches, Vivre card data quietly adjusts distances, ages, and classifications, and later arcs drop one-line explanations that retroactively justify why nobody used sea stone more or why this bounty was symbolic. It's like watching him backfill a database in real time. I want to emphasize, the iceberg isn't just cataloging what the story says. It's tracking when it said it, and how later info forces you to either patch or delete your headcanon. That's why, once you realize even the starter sea isn't stable, the next logical step is to zoom in on the most deceptively quiet place of all, Fuchsia Village and the whole Dawn Island region, where a few throwaway details have spawned some of the deepest, strangest theories on the chart. Fuchsia Village and the Dawn Island problem. So when most people think Fuchsia Village, they're not thinking political thriller, they're thinking tiny harbor, Makino's bar, Shanks losing an arm, and Garp occasionally dropping in to commit war crimes on child safety regulations. It's the cozy JRPG starter town. Nothing scary lives here except the concept of Luffy's education. But here's an interesting thing. That same island is also the Goa Kingdom. You've got the walled royal city with its nobles, the gray terminal trash mountain where all the garbage goes, and the celestial dragon visit that ends with the whole slum literally set on fire. So the place we mentally file under wholesome Luffy origin is textually one of the most politically loaded locations in the entire East Blue. As far as world building goes, Dawn Island is doing way too much. That's where the Dawn Island problem starts. Once you try to actually map Fuchsia, Goa, Gray Terminal, and the surrounding waters, the geography becomes a vague mess. Garp can just stroll between kingdom and village. Shank's crew hangs out in Fuchsia for ages. Sabo rows a dinghy from the noble district to the slums to the shore like it's a quick commute. But then the Goa nobles treat Gray Terminal as this distant, quarantined hell. How far apart are these places supposed to be? Why can random pirates dock at Fuchsia, but the world government somehow can't see anything going on 5 minutes away? Iceberg charts love this. You start getting entries like Fuchsia is deliberately isolated, or Dawn Island is under special world government surveillance, or that there are hidden sea routes only revolutionary and marine forces know about. People point at how quickly Dragon's ship appears during the Gray Terminal fire, or how Garp just happens to base his weird grandpa routine out of this one nowhere village and go, okay, that's not random. To which I say, we are absolutely overthinking it. And also, I want to emphasize that overthinking it is the whole point. And to be fair, Oda kind of invites this retroactively. Early on, Dawn Island is just Luffy's backwater. Later, he makes Dragon Luffy's dad, ties Sabo and the Revolutionary Army directly into Goa's class nightmare. And suddenly, this sleepy hometown is a crossroads for the future Pirate King, the most wanted man in the world, and the #2 revolutionary. That's not a starter town anymore. That's a narrative power outlet. Then you add the obscure sources. The Vivre card gives extra detail on Goa's political structure and its caste-like treatment of the Gray Terminal. SBS answers casually mention Makino's child, Garp's mysterious movements, and Oda jokes about Garp having business on the island that we never actually see. Each tiny scrap becomes fuel for theories about a hidden marine outpost tucked in the cliffs, or a revolutionary safe house just offshore. Dawn Island ends up as a microcosm of the whole One Piece class system. Nobles in their pristine city, trash people in a burning heap, and rural villagers pretending they're not in the middle of it. Because as far as thematic weight goes, that's a lot for one map dot, which is why fans keep suspecting there's still more we haven't been told. And if Luffy's supposedly boring birthplace is already this unstable, what happens when we zoom out to the series' entire timeline and realize that also doesn't quite add up? The wobbly timeline. Ages, flashbacks, and 800 years of confusion. So zooming out, we meet One Piece's true final boss, the calendar. The series looks incredibly tight on a reread until you start asking, wait, how old was he during that? And the whole thing turns into a wobbly Jenga tower of ages and flashbacks. Let's lay out the official basics, because as far as the surface-level story goes, it's actually pretty simple. The Great Age of Piracy kicks off with Roger's execution about 22 to 24 years before Chapter 1, depending on which data book you're married to. The Void Century is parked in that nice, comfy 800 to 900 years ago range. O'Hara burns down 20 years before the present. God Valley explodes off the map 38 years ago. And everyone nods, like this is a clean, functional system, to which I say, sure, if you don't look at literally anything else. Here's an interesting thing. Once you plug character ages and childhood flashbacks into those anchor points, it gets messy fast. Luffy is 17 at the start. Ace dies at 20. Sabo is Sabo. Garp is the world's oldest boomer. And Dragon is supposedly founding a global revolutionary army sometime in the middle of all this. We're told Dragon starts the revolutionary movement around 10 to 15 years ago, but that's also when he's dropping by Dawn Island to watch Luffy, while Shanks is already a big enough deal to bet his arm on the next era, and Mihawk is wandering around being bored because his favorite rival just lost his head. Fans love drawing these insane spreadsheets where, for example, Shanks has to get the straw hat from Roger, become an Emperor Tier legend, meet Mihawk, have their legendary duels, break up with Mihawk, then go hang out in East Blue for years, all in the couple decades between God Valley and Luffy being 7. Does it kind of work? Yeah. Does it also imply Shanks is living on 40-hour days? Also, yeah. This is where classic Iceberg entries show up. Timeline inconsistencies, Dragon's missing decade, Garp in 2 places at once. God Valley is a big one. It's 38 years ago during the Rocks era when Garp and Roger team up. Line that up with their ages, and you get Garp allegedly being peak Marine, while also somehow having time to be a deadbeat grandpa in training. O'Hara is another. Robin is 8 when it's destroyed 20 years ago, but some dialogue and data book notes make it feel like she's been an outlaw researcher for longer than her own lifespan. I want to emphasize, Oda has basically admitted he fudges exact dates for drama. And to be fair, that's normal. The problem is, once you publish Vivre cards and official timelines, you've weaponized the autism. Databooks fix some gaps, then immediately create new ones, so fans have to pick manga canon, SBS canon, or chart canon. And once the last 40 years are this unstable, the 800-year void century becomes a playground. If the recent history can't stay straight, what are the odds the world government's official calendar isn't cooked? That's where you get deep iceberg stuff. Time loops, erased years, fake centuries inserted to hide an extra void decade. Even the idea that the red line itself reset the world's geography and the clock. Which raises the next cursed question. If time is this fuzzy, what about space? Because the second you look at the actual world map, the geography starts breaking in even funnier ways. The impossible map, Grand Line geography, and Lost Islands. So, on paper, the One Piece world map is actually kind of elegant. You've got a globe, cleanly sliced by the red line vertically and the Grand Line horizontally, 4 blues in the corners, calm belts hugging the Grand Line, and then the New World as Grand Line but on nightmare mode. It's the sort of simple, satisfying layout that makes you think, wow, Oda really planned this, to which I say, give it 5 chapters and it collapses instantly. Because as far as distances go, nothing adds up. Luffy spends days crossing tiny stretches of ocean, then apparently speedruns half a hemisphere between panels. Drum Island feels right next door to Alabasta until you remember the crew nearly froze and starved on the way. Weather is controlled by currents and magnetic fields, and then ships just brute force through cyclones because the plot said so. The iceberg entry, Grand Line doesn't make sense, isn't a complaint, it's a summary. Here's an interesting thing. Once you start tracking islands, it gets worse. We have misplaced islands that jump around between maps, and erased islands that are mentioned once and then vanish, like they got Buster called out of the canon. Some locations show up on official maps or Vivre cards and never ever appear in the manga. Others appear in flashbacks with no name, and fans spend years trying to staple them onto the existing globe like conspiracy theorists with red string. Reverse Mountain is where the whole system openly laughs at you. All 4 blues feed up 4 rivers into a single summit. Then one river drops you into the Grand Line. Cool visual, 0 logistics. How do you leave? How does trade work? Why isn't every Marine base just camping that choke point? The world government allegedly has global power, but their main highway is a suicidal water slide guarded by giant whales. And to be fair, that's very One Piece. Oda has tried to clarify this, which somehow makes it messier. Exhibition maps, databook diagrams, SBS sketches. Each one nudges an island a bit, reshapes a coastline, or quietly removes something. Some of them contradict the manga, some contradict each other, and fans still treat them like sacred cartography because we're all complicit in this geography LARP. Out of that chaos, you get lost or shifted island theories. Maybe that random burning island in a cover story was actually a known kingdom before it sank. Maybe a flashback village is the pre-destruction version of some new world ruin. People argue that entire landmasses were literally erased, either by ancient weapons or the Red Line's creation, which is a fun idea until you realize it might actually be true. And I want to emphasize, this isn't just map pedantry. Poneglyphs, ancient ruins, O'Hara, Shandora, Fishman Island. They all cluster suspiciously around the Red Line and calm belts. Void century secrets are physically locked behind the worst sea routes. Is that deliberate in-universe design? Or Oda just stacking drama on the cool-looking parts of the map? The iceberg lives in that gap. So now that we've broken the planet into a vague, beautiful mess, the next question is, who's actually living on it? Because some of the background nobodies walking across these impossible islands have more canon backstory than half the main cast. And that's where we're heading next. Background nobodies with canon backstories. Some series barely name their main characters. One Piece is out here giving the guy in seat 3B on a marine ship a tragic childhood, a favorite snack, and a canonical blood type. This is the part of the iceberg where you realize the background is staring back. Because as far as character design goes, Oda is a menace. Most mangaka will copy-paste a crowd. Oda will design 30 unique silhouettes, 5 joke outfits, and 3 people who look like they walked in from a completely different series. You see a random bartender with a weird chin and think, fun gag. Oda sees a future SBS answer, a Vive Ricard slot, and probably a cover story cameo. Here's an interesting thing. Once the SBS and the data books get involved, that throwaway gag stops being a joke and becomes law. A kid writes in, "Who's that guy sleeping in the corner of Garp's ship?" And Oda, instead of saying, "No idea," goes, "Ah yes, that's insert full name, age 27, from the East Blue. He joined the Marines after his village was burned. He likes curry. And also, he has a devil fruit I'm never going to show you." The Vive Ricards double down. Suddenly, that background revolutionary from Baltigo has a bounty, a birthplace, and confirmation that, yes, they survived that off-screen raid. We've seen random Marines like the guys around Smoker or Toshigi get full profiles. East Blue civilians quietly reappear in cover stories running successful businesses, and revolutionaries who were just faces in a crowd later get databook confirmations that they're commanders in regions we haven't even visited. You blinked during a panel in Logtown? Cool. That guy now technically outranks half the villains you remember. This is where the iceberg charts go feral. You get entries like, "This Drum Island doctor is canonically alive," "That one Goa Kingdom kid is secretly a noble," or "This pirate shows up in 3 arcs," all built on one line, in an SBS, and a hat you vaguely recognize in a background shot. Casual viewers are like, "Who?" To which I say, exactly. The whole power of the iceberg is weaponizing the fact that Oda refuses to let anyone just be a nobody. And to be fair, it creates a hilarious hierarchy. Some guy who poured Zoro a drink in a cover story has a fuller biography than, say, Miss Valentine. We know his hometown, dream, and confirmed relationship status. Meanwhile, a mid-tier villain's backstory is just was evil, and that's it. I want to emphasize, this is extremely on-brand for Oda's chaotic attention span. But it's not just comedy. It's meta-lore. Fans use these micro-backstories to infer entire cultures. If 3 unrelated background dudes share a tattoo, that's suddenly an unseen faction. If a Vivre card says a random marine is from some tiny West Blue island, that island quietly becomes real geography we have to account for. The dark side is that a lot of this stuff quietly confirms grim fates. A cheerful slave in the background of Sabaody. Later Vivre card died in an off-screen massacre. A kid from O'Hara with a name. SBS. Yeah, they didn't make it. These are the entries that sink to the lower tiers, because they take a panel you barely noticed and turn it into a war crime. And if Oda is willing to flesh out nobodies like this, what about the things he never shows at all? The devil fruits that only exist in interviews, the powers he half-jokes about in SBS, the abilities that live entirely in data books. That's where the iceberg stops being about characters and starts being about the invisible power system sitting just off-panel. Unseen devil fruits, powers that exist only inside material. Devil fruits are supposed to be a clean system. 3 types, right? Logia, Zoan, Paramecia. Easy. Except it's One Piece, so of course even the fruit taxonomy quietly turns into a cryptid sighting. On paper, it's simple. Paramecia are the grab-bag weirdos. Zoans turn you into animals. Logias make you an element. Then Oda starts stacking subtypes like a gotcha addict, ancient Zoans, mythical Zoans, special Paramecia that are Paramecia but actually not, but actually yes. Artificial smiles that are diet Zoans with a side of body horror, unique awakenings that sometimes change the environment, sometimes just make you burlier, and sometimes turn you into a literal god. As far as clean system design goes, this is a beautiful mess. Now, layer on a second category the manga barely acknowledges, off-screen or side material devil fruits. These are powers that technically exist, but only if you're the kind of person who has read an SBS from 2003 at 3 in the morning. They live in Vivre cards, data books, throwaway Oda sketches, and one-line jokes that fans still catalog like they're Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's an interesting thing. A ton of minor characters quietly get fruits assigned in Vivre cards that the story never shows off. Some random background pirate? Turns out he has a Paramecia that lets him flatten himself like paper. A cover story villain who just seemed kinda fast? The card says, no, that was a speed fruit the whole time. And to be fair, this retroactive labeling helps keep the world feeling consistent. But it also means the real number of fruits is way higher than what the manga visually communicates. Then you have SBS joke fruits. Oda will casually say, oh yeah, if Usopp's slingshot ate a devil fruit, it'd be this. And fandom goes, cool, that's going on the wiki. People on the internet like to say, those don't count, they're jokes, to which I say, tell that to the iceberg charts that list every single one under unseen fruits like they're classified weapons. And sitting right next to that are the unconfirmed or lost fruits. Anytime we see a weird, unnamed ability for one panel, a guy who melts into the floor, a cover story character doing something impossible, there's a theory that Oda has a specific fruit in his notebook that just hasn't been formally introduced yet. because as far as we know, that notebook is real. Oda has mentioned having a stockpile of unused devil fruit ideas he pulls from when needed. I want to emphasize how much that wrecks power scaling. You can't actually say, "We've seen the ceiling," when there's a literal off-screen catalog of powers, plus databook-only fruits, plus gag concepts that could be upgraded into horror at any moment. Iceberg charts lean into this as system horror. The more we map the visible part of the system, the more we realize how much is hidden under the waterline. And once you accept that there are countless unseen fruits, the darker implications kick in. If the world government is willing to mass-produce smiles, what are they doing with unique, never-public fruits? How many child soldiers, Cypher Paul experiments, or failed Seraphim prototypes are built around powers we'll only ever see as a single line in a data book? So, if the fruit system is this incomplete on purpose, what else is being quietly rewritten in the margins? Next, we need to talk about the meta-lore engines themselves, SBS, databooks, Vavra cards, as both sacred lore gold mines and the chaotic gremlins that keep breaking the iceberg every time we think we've finished it. SBS, Vavra cards, and databooks, the hidden canon layer. So here's the cursed truth of the One Piece iceberg. A terrifying amount of it is built on stuff that never appeared in the actual manga. It lives in the margins, in bonus pages, in card packs you've never seen unless you've fallen completely off the deep end. First layer of that hidden canon is SBS, the Shitsumon Oboshu Suru corners at the back of Tankobon volumes. Basically, fan mail plus Oda's brain on sleep deprivation. People ask, "What's kids' favorite food?" Or, "Can you draw the admirals as kids?" And Oda just answers, "Sometimes it's a real lore drop. Sometimes it's a drawing of a gun that shoots poop." And to be fair, you kind of need both to understand this man. Then we've got the data books, color walks, and the big ones like blue, yellow, green, and deep. These are the giant lore encyclopedias that tell you things like, "This random Baroque works guy's dream is to open a cafe," and "Here's a map of an island we never visit again." On top of that are exhibition catalogs and official guides that quietly slip in world maps, timelines, and early concept art. Finally, the Vivre card game, plastic folders full of character stat sheets, birthdays, combat style, affiliations, sometimes even new attacks that Oda supervises. So, what's the canonical weight of all this? Fans basically run a tiered trust system. Manga, greater than SBS, and Vivre cards supervised by Oda, greater than older data books, greater than anime. Because as far as we can tell, Oda will write something in an SBS, then 10 years later contradict it in story, and just shrug. He's set ages that don't quite line up, given us heights that break scale charts, and then the manga walks in and says, "Actually, no, that guy was lying." Here's an interesting thing. A ton of iceberg entries are literally just, "I read the back of the card." Character birthdays, blood types, hometown islands, exact bounty numbers between arcs, confirmation that a background guy did or did not die at Marineford. This is all Vivre card and databook fuel. Ages that lock the O'Hara incident into a tighter timeline. Notes that quietly confirm someone was a student of a famous swordsman throw away SBS lines that identify a character's race and suddenly blow open Elbaf or Lunarian theories. And the SBS tone is its own mess. Oda trolls constantly. He'll answer a serious question with a joke, then hide real lore inside the joke. Fans have to play this deranged game of, is this canon, or is this Oda being a gremlin? To which I say, yes. If he draws a chart of devil fruit lineages as a gag, the fandom will still spend 5 years power scaling it. 5 Ricards quietly retcon things too. A character who was just CP9 guy becomes officially CP0, with a rank, a birthplace, and a new epithet. And suddenly, that one panel from Eni's lobby means something else. New affiliations, new epithets, even new spellings of names recontextualize old scenes and spawn fresh conspiracy webs. I want to emphasize how this plugs into the iceberg. The deeper tiers basically assume you've inhaled all of this. It's like a secret language. If someone says, "That's from Green," you either nod knowingly or you're locked out of half the jokes. But now that we've collected every sidebook, card, and cursed Q&A, we can finally point all that meta lore at the big stuff. Next, we start tracing the early, almost throwaway hints of the Void Century and ancient weapons that have been sitting just under the surface this whole time. Early echoes of the Void Century and ancient weapons. So, once you've armed yourself with every SBS Vivre card and limited edition postcard Oda doodled on in 1999, you suddenly realize, oh, the Void Century has been screaming at us since basically Alabasta. People like to say, yeah, that's late-game lore, to which I say, mate, it's literally baked into Robin's trauma arc. Let's lock in the basics first, because as far as iceberg foundations go, this is the bedrock, the Void Century. A full 100-year chunk of history scrubbed so hard, it might as well be a YouTube video with 10 copyright claims. Poneglyphs, indestructible stone, USB drives scattered around the world, written in a dead script only a handful of people can read, and ancient weapons, Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus, 3 vaguely defined superweapons said to have the power to destroy the world, which is an incredibly chill thing to just have lying around. The earliest time the story actually yells, "Hey, pay attention, this matters," is O'Hara. Professor Clover's speech is the first time we hear Void Century tied to a true history, and the world government responds with, orbital laser genocide. And to be fair, that's a pretty strong editorial stance on historical research. Then we get Robin's backstory layered right on top of that. A child who can read poneglyphs, branded a demon because she can unlock that lost century. The lore is literally crying in the background while you're crying in the foreground. Here's an interesting thing. The first time the term ancient weapon drops is in Alabasta, with the poneglyph in the royal tomb. Crocodile doesn't care about the history. He just wants Pluton, the supposed ultimate battleship. Robin lies about what the stone says. We get the phrase, ancient weapon Pluton, and that's it. No blueprints, no flashback, just, this could end the world. Anyway, moving on. The system is intentionally a vague mess. I want to emphasize how little we actually know at this stage. We're told there's a true history, that the government is terrified of it, that these weapons can reshape or annihilate the world. But we don't have a clean timeline, we don't know who built what, and we have no idea if the weapons are ships, people, or something weirder. It's all mood, no manual. And this is where iceberg charts go wild. Joy Boy's apology on the Fishman Island poneglyph branches straight off true history. Noah's giant ship and its mysterious purpose tied to Poseidon, which is itself an ancient weapon retcon pointing back to those early mentions. Uranus's location? Every time the sky sneezes, someone goes, "That's Uranus," and draws another arrow back to Alabasta and O'Hara. Behind the scenes, Oda is doing a nasty little magic trick. He seeds the heaviest emotional scenes. O'Hara's destruction, Robin barely surviving, Cobra's quiet concern over the poneglyph with tiny lore flags. You're too busy sobbing, "I want to live," to notice that the entire meta-structure of world history just got laid down in between Buster Call panels. Side material quietly props this up. Databooks confirm extra poneglyph locations we haven't seen in the main story yet. SBS Answers casually mention how many exist. Exhibition notes talk about their creation and how they're basically indestructible. Oda literally wrote, "No, you can't just blow them up and skip the mystery." All of that feeds into the meta-lore. The Void Century isn't just a mystery box, it's a design choice. It's a 100-year blank Google Doc where Oda can paste new revelations and retroactively claim, "Yeah, that was always part of the true history." Flexible, messy, powerful. But if the past can be erased that cleanly, what about the present? Next, we need to look at the world government's black ops, the quiet assassinations, vanished islands, and implied atrocities that iceberg charts shove way down into the darker tiers. The world government's off-screen crimes. So here's the fun thing about the world government. The more the story smiles, the more you realize the background is doing war crimes speedruns. One Piece is this bright toy box adventure, and then you remember, oh right, these guys canonically glass libraries. We actually do see some of it, which is already a lot. Ohara isn't just a sad flashback, it's a full tutorial on how to erase a Civilization 101. Evacuate the scholars, line up the warships, Buster Call, done. Eni's lobby? Same playbook. The island of justice is treated as so disposable that Spandam can literally phone in its destruction. Add in Maria Joie, where slaves are hunted for sport, and celestial dragons treat people as furniture. And you start to get the idea. When the higher-ups talk about order, they mean you are property. And to be fair, the regular Marines are a mess of contradictions. You've got Kobe, Helmeppo, Fujitora trying to be decent, and then Akainu casually magma-punching deserters, Kizaru nuking Sabaudi like he's bored, and Green Bull rolling into Wano ready to colonize it 5 minutes after the final battle. That's the on-panel stuff. That's what Oda is comfortable showing us in a supposedly all-ages series. But here's an interesting thing. The iceberg people are way more obsessed with what we don't see. We get throwaway lines about islands that no longer exist, nations that were purged, whole regions that have been cleansed of criminals. No flashback, no panel, just a casual mention and then silence. You look at the world map and notice countries that existed in one arc never get referenced again. Did they just fall off? Or did someone decide they were reading the wrong books? That's where entries like Erased Kingdoms and Buster Calls we never saw come from. Ohara stops feeling like a unique tragedy and starts reading as the one time Oda let us watch standard operating procedure. Because as far as the system goes, why would you invent a weapon that extreme and only use it twice in 800 years? The Vivre cards and databooks quietly back this up, hinting at islands wiped out by marine operations or weirdly frequent Buster Call authorizations that the manga never dramatizes. Then you have CP9 and CP0, the Black Ops branch of all this. We see a handful of missions, judicial assassination, cover-ups, Child Robin getting drafted as a living weapon. The implication is that for every Water 7 style arc we watch, there are dozens of jobs where they just show up, kill a mayor, burn the records, and leave. I want to emphasize how casually the story treats this. Lucci brags about body counts like it's a performance review. Stussy jokes about cleaning up people. the SBS will drop a line about some prison execution method and move on like Oda didn't just describe medieval torture. People on the internet like to say, well, that's just cartoon villainy, to which I say, sure, but cartoon villainy doesn't usually get tied directly into an 800-year historical cover-up. The Iceberg crowd reads all of this as a scaled-down echo of whatever the founders did during the Void Century. If the legitimate government is already nuking islands to hide archaeology, what did their ancestors do to win the war in the first place? And that tonal tension is the point. One Piece keeps the jokes loud and the atrocities mostly off-screen, which is exactly the kind of dissonance iceberg charts love. Because if this is what happens in the sunlight, what's going on in the shadows, where the human auctions, underworld brokers, and illegal labs don't even bother pretending they're justice, underworld networks, brokers, slavers, and black markets. So when we finally do go into the shadows, One Piece doesn't ease us in with subtlety. It just throws us into Sabady's human auction house like, surprise, the world runs on slavery. You've got numbered humans, fishmen, even giants being sold while nobles sip wine. And to be fair, the series plays it as this shocking aberration, right up until you realize the Marines know this place exists and just kind of let it rock. From there, the iceberg starts pointing at the stuff we only half see. Dressrosa shows us Doflamingo as Joker, the smiling middleman of everything awful. Weapons, smiles, slaves, probably cursed beanie babies. Punk Hazard gives us Caesar's Labs, kids in test tubes, SAD production, and that whole smile assembly line that runs Punk Hazard to Dressrosa to Wano. On paper, it's a villain plot. In practice, it's a logistics diagram for industrialized horror. Here's an interesting thing. Those underworld broker meetings we see on the snail screens. That's the tip of a system the iceberg loves to obsess over. Shadowy silhouettes watching Daffy's live stream of Caesar's capture. Anonymous voices bidding on weapons. Information traders who can move a devil fruit from a battlefield in the New World to a noble's dinner party in Maria Joie. Fans slap broker identities way down on the chart because, as far as we know, any of those silhouettes could be a Yonko ally, a revolutionary mole, or some random kingdom's finance minister buying child soldiers on company time. And once you start thinking that way, Sabaody stops being that one bad island and becomes a node on what iceberg entries call noble hunting grounds and celestial dragon shopping routes. The idea is that entire regions function as livestock farms, kidnapping zones, raided villages, defeated pirate crews quietly funneled into chains. Oda has dropped Vivre card notes about specific brokers operating in the Sabaody area, and SBS comments that yes, some pirates basically specialize in hunting rare races because the prices are insane. It's not a glitch. It's the business model. The world government's role is that classic One Piece mess of officially we condemn this and unofficially we escort the buyers. Slavery is banned, except for the celestial dragons. Human experimentation is illegal, unless Vegapunk or a conveniently deniable partner like Caesar is doing it on a remote island. People say the Marines are the good guys, to which I say, mate, your good guys are providing security for an auction house. I want to emphasize how central someone like Doflamingo is here. He's a former celestial dragon, a Shichibukai, a pirate captain, and the underworld's favorite middle manager. He sits at the intersection of noble privilege, state power, and pure criminal logistics, which is why he's basically a giant glowing node on every underworld-themed iceberg diagram. And if this is the visible part, The auctions, the smile factories, the kids we actually see. What does the invisible layer look like? What black projects are still running with erased funding codes and dead scientists, especially when it comes to children, devil fruits, and artificial beings that never make it out of the lab alive? Children, experiments, and the ethics Oda hides in the margins. And the answer is, it looks like a science fair run by war criminals. Because once you start tracking kids in One Piece, the series quietly turns into a long, colorful report on crimes against minors. We get the obvious horror reel first. Punk Hazard's giant children, literally dosed with experimental drugs until their bodies stretch and their minds fracture. Caesar, clowning around in a lab coat, running lethal trials as if he's testing new flavors of soda. Vegapunk's name stamped somewhere in the paperwork, tied to projects like the Pacifista line and artificial devil fruits that absolutely did not begin with version 1.0 works perfectly. And then you remember Robin, hunted from age 8, or Law, a terminally ill child folded into Doflamingo's personal science project. The show plays it as adventure, but if you describe those plot lines to someone who's never seen One Piece, you sound like you're reading from a Hague indictment. But here's an interesting thing. Once you see that pattern, you can't stop seeing it. CP9 are basically gifted kids' assassins camp. The orphans in Dressrosa grow up playing Don't Step on the Toys or You'll Die. And Wano's children are literally fed weapons and poison as part of the Smile supply chain. Fishman Island's kids drink in racism like tap water. You get this vague, awful child-soldier pipeline where every institution, world government, pirates, revolutionaries, has its own version of weaponized youth. We cheer for the cool ones, to which I say, yes, same, but also, this is a mess. Iceberg charts love labeling that middle tier with stuff like failed experiments and pacifista prototypes. And to be fair, the text kind of backs that up. For every functioning cyborg Kuma we see, how many bodies did they burn through? Every successful gigantification attempt implies a landfill of kids who didn't survive the dose. Oda never draws the pile, but he keeps drawing the invoices. Vegapunk sits right at the center of this. He's the genius trying to drag the world into the future, working for the government, because as far as he's concerned, that's the only way to fund his ideas. Sometimes that gives us miraculous medicine or clean energy. Sometimes it gives us child-sized drug trials and living weapons with erased personalities. Caesar is just the ID version of that same system. No ethics committee, no remorse, just, can I make this explode harder? I want to emphasize that the difference between them is intention, not outcome. Side material quietly turns the knife. Vive recards confirm ages that make certain experiments way more unsettling. Databooks mention test subjects in passing. SBS answers joke about labs and prototypes that, if you map the timelines, imply kids were in cages off-panel while the Straw Hats were doing gags 2 islands away. All of this feeds into One Piece's favorite argument, inherited will versus manufactured destiny. What's darker than trying to control the future? Taking children, rewriting their bodies and choices, and pretending that's their path. The series doesn't linger on gore, but the implications are so bleak that iceberg makers shove this stuff deep into the disturbing tiers. And if this is what the grounded material science of One Piece does to people, what happens when we move into the ideas that break reality itself? Time loops, world resets, and the possibility that the story you're reading might also be an experiment. Romance Dawn Graveyard, the prototypes Oda buried. So when people say Oda planned everything from Chapter 0, To which I say, kind of, but also absolutely not. Because Chapter 0 has like 3 different ghosts. Welcome to the Romance Dawn Graveyard, where we dig up the prototypes Oda literally killed and then quietly reanimated inside modern One Piece. Here's an interesting thing. There isn't just one Romance Dawn. There are 2 one-shots, usually called A and B, and then a rough early serialization pitch that mutates again into Chapter 1. Each one is the same basic idea, Rubber Kid, Pirate Dream, but the origin, Shanks's role, and the world's rules keep getting rewritten, like Oda is speed-running alternate timelines. In One-Shot A, Luffy eats the gum-gum fruit from a treasure chest on some random mountain bandit's turf. Shanks isn't a mentor. He's this already established big-shot pirate who kind of drifts through the story like early series Mihawk energy. The world feels small, almost Dragon Ball gag era. Pirates are just strong weirdos. Devil fruits are a vague magic MacGuffin. And the power system is cartoon physics. Don't worry about it. One-Shot B flips it. Luffy's dad is actually a pirate. There's a proto-Nami thief girl who's way more central, and Shanks is downgraded into more of a passing influence. The hierarchy of pirates is clearer. Bounties, ranks, this sense that there are organized crews at the top. And you can see the skeleton of the Yonko idea without the marine balance yet. It's like Oda is testing, what if the world is already ruled by monsters before Luffy even leaves shore? Then the early serialization pitch, which we only know from fragments and interviews, pushes harder on a global resistance vibe. You have this early revolutionary army concept, anti-world government rebels as a big named faction from the start, rather than Dragon just smirking in a hood for 400 chapters. As far as meta-lore goes, that's huge, because it tells us the revolution thread wasn't a late add-on. It was something Oda deliberately buried to keep the East Blue arc simple. A lot of ideas get cut, but they don't stay dead. Proto-Gum-Gum powers, where Luffy inflates different body parts in more grotesque ways. That DNA comes back as Gear 3rd, Nightmare Luffy, even some of Kaido's drunk modes, the loose pirate hierarchies, and heroic outlaw bandits from the one-shots. Those get split into Shichibukai, Yonko, and Revolutionary Army, like Oda disassembled one messy system into 3 cleaner ones. And to be fair, some characters are basically reincarnated prototypes. The proto-Nami thief girl is Nami, plus a dash of early Robin cynicism, that stern old Marine/authority figure archetype. You can see Garp's bones in there. Goofy exterior, terrifying power, weirdly personal stake in Luffy. I want to emphasize how wild that is. Non-canon drafts are foreshadowing canon emotional beats decades before they land. So when we look at the iceberg and see Romance Dawn variants down in the mid-tiers, it's not just trivia for hipster fans. It's a map of roads Oda almost took. If he was once willing to make the revolution front and center, or have Luffy inherit a pirate legacy directly from his dad, what does that say about where the endgame might still be allowed to go? Are we actually heading toward one of those scrapped timelines wrapping back around? Because if the prototypes are alternate universes, the next layer of the iceberg is where people start arguing that One Piece itself might be too. East Blue, that never was, Lost Islands, and timeline weirdness. So if One Piece might be an alternate universe of its own, then East Blue is the pilot episode that forgot to update its Google Maps. The more you reread those early chapters with the late-game knowledge, the more it feels like we're watching Oda quietly shove continents around off-screen. Because as far as travel goes, East Blue is completely insane. We're told it's the weakest sea, tiny compared to the Grand Line, and yet the Going Merry is out here doing multi-island cruises in what feels like a long weekend. Syrup Village to Barati to Arlong Park? Days. Meanwhile, post Eni's lobby, a trip between two Grand Line islands can take a week with log pose waiting times stacked on top. Early on, Oda throws out distances and days like they're candy, and then just kind of stops. At some point, he realizes that if he keeps giving hard numbers, the geography collapses, so time becomes this vague narrative soup where a few days can mean anything. Here's an interesting thing. East Blue itself used to be busier. You get random mentions of islands and capes in early chapters and data books that never show up again, like someone trimmed the set after the dress rehearsal. The original Romance Dawn one-shots have different ports and little way stations that got cannibalized into later locations, but some names survive in SBS answers and Vivre cards as if they were once part of a much denser map. There are Marines stationed on unnamed bases we never revisit, trade routes that imply extra land masses, and cover story panels that quietly place minor islands in East Blue that the manga never acknowledges. It feels like Oda started with a super granular sea chart, then compressed it into a straight line of Luffy's greatest hits. And to be fair, the geography is only half the mess. The timeline is where East Blue really starts screaming. Take Luffy's childhood. We're told Shanks stayed in Fuchsia Village for about a year. We see Luffy as a little kid during that time, and then later flashbacks need him training with Garp, meeting Ace and Sabo, and doing Bandit Forest Boot Camp, all without breaking the ages already printed in like Volume 1. Garp is allegedly a busy marine hero, yet he's somehow constantly on Dawn Island while also chasing Roger, raising Dragon's Kid, and doing whatever he was doing at God Valley. People try to spreadsheet this into a clean chart, to which I say, good luck, mate, you're fighting God. I want to emphasize this isn't Oda bad at math. It's Oda treating the world less like a fixed globe and more like a stage he can relight between acts. East Blue is the first place you can see the set walls flexing. Once we hit the new world, that attitude becomes the whole power system of the story's lore. Islands that only exist for one arc, history that rearranges itself with each poneglyph, a void century that literally cannot be mapped yet. East Blue that never quite was is our warning label that the map is lying to us on purpose, which is exactly what we need for the next layer of the iceberg. Retcons in plain sight, when canon quietly changes its mind. East Blue lies to us on purpose, and the rest of the story absolutely joins in. One Piece isn't just a world of islands, it's a world of quiet retcons, where reality politely updates itself while nobody's looking. Let's start with the famous ones. Early on, devil fruits are sold as this very clean system. You can't swim, you get one power, and that's it. Then we meet Blackbeard, who says, "What if no?" And suddenly, one body can hold multiple fruits. Mythical zones can resurrect you, and awakenings rewrite the environment. Did Oda break his own rule, or did he leave it just vague enough that one fruit per person was more social belief than physics? Because as far as the text goes, he never carves it into stone tablets. Same deal with hockey. Pre-time skip, it doesn't exist. Post-time skip, it has always existed actually, and also Shanks scaring a Sea King, Mantra in Skypiea, and Rayleigh's flex on the auction house were all hockey the whole time. People call this a mess, to which I say, mate, we are the mess. Oda just quietly backfilled a power system around moments he already liked. It's retroactive, but it's coherent, retroactive. Log poses, too. At first, it's simple. One needle, one island, follow the magnet. Then we hit the new world, and suddenly there are triple needles, erratic readings, islands stacked on top of each other metaphorically. The rule didn't break. The rule zoomed out. The early explanation was a tutorial level pretending to be the full manual. Here's an interesting thing. That same behavior shows up in obscure places nobody checks. Early SBS answers give characters joke ages or intentionally fuzzy backgrounds. Later, vivre cards roll in like, actually, here's their exact birthplace, blood type, and the war they fought in, and the manga just vibes as if that was always true. Early color spreads show the Straw Hats in outfits or with animals that later get reframed as canon hometown nods or future designs. Did Oda plan that from day one? Probably not. Did he happily steal from himself when it fit? Absolutely. I want to emphasize the difference between a mistake and a deliberate overwrite. A mistake is Pell dying in Alabasta and then awkwardly living because Oda couldn't commit. A deliberate overwrite is Haki. He sees a narrative need, relabels old scenes, and builds a full system that lets future arcs function. One runs away from consequences. The other runs toward a long-term idea he didn't have language for yet. And to be fair, this is why the iceberg gets dangerous. If Oda is willing to repaint surface facts like ages, maps, and basic power rules, what happens when we stare at the really deep stuff? Void Century, the Will of D, ancient weapons, and treat every early line as gospel? What if some of that is intentional misdirection, training us to chase the wrong pattern? So the question isn't, what did Oda say once? It's, what did Oda keep, upgrade, or quietly delete? Because our next layer goes into exactly those pressure points, the places where the text and the meta-text stop agreeing, and the story starts winking at us. The Geography Conspiracy, a world that doesn't quite fit together. So if the meta-text can lie to us, what about the literal planet? Because as far as One Piece goes, the world map is that group project where everyone turned in a different version and the teacher just stapled them together. On paper it's simple. You've got the red line, one giant continent circling the globe north-south, then the Grand Line, an equatorial sea wrapping around east-west, intersecting at Maria Joie and Fishman Island to make a big plus sign. Surrounding the Grand Line are the calm belts, no wind, no currents, full of sea kings, nature's do not enter tape. Navigating the Grand Line needs log poses because the magnetic fields are weird, and the New World is that but worse. Cool, clean system, very elegant, and to be fair, it works until you actually look at it. Here's an interesting thing. Early diagrams and the official world map in the data books don't quite match what we see in the manga. In some SBS sketches, the New World looks chunkier, like there are way more land masses crowding the red line than we ever sail past. The map that shows the Straw Hats' route has islands placed in an order that quietly contradicts earlier four blues evenly divided talk. We're told the red line is a continuous wall, but then Reverse Mountain is just a big hole in it with four rivers that somehow all flow up. Sure, and the climate. The Grand Line is sold as weather chaos, which is fine. But Oda also locks in specific climate bands in a data book, then casually has us jump from Alabasta's desert to Drum's snow to Skypa's sky tropics in ways that don't line up with those bands. The New World is even worse. Punk Hazard's Fire and Ice Island is canonically a side effect of two admirals fighting, which is cool. But that means individual battles can rewrite the climate grid. At that point, what are we even mapping? People will say, it's just a fun adventure map. Stop overthinking it. To which I say, Oda is the guy who remembered a random bandit from Romance Dawn and brought him back in a data book 20 years later. When the geography is this much of a vague mess, I start suspecting intent. I want to emphasize how many tiny details point to the world being engineered. The red line looks less like a natural continent and more like a containment wall. The Grand Line is a perfect ring that you can't approach directly because of the calm belts, like a moat around a prison. Maria Joie sits exactly at the crosshair where Red Line and Grand Line meet, on top of an elevator to Fishman Island, which itself is under a literal bubble ceiling. That's not a continent. That's a control panel. Once you start framing it as a post-war construction project, the Void Century and ancient weapons slide in a little too neatly. A weapon that controls the sea, a ship that can traverse anything, something that destroys islands in a straight line. Suddenly, a ring-shaped ocean and a world-spanning wall feel like a scar, or maybe a bandage, from a conflict we're not allowed to see. And if the planet is a rigged arena, then the next question isn't, where is Raftel? It's, what was this world before someone rewrote it? Which is exactly where the iceberg goes next. SBS, the joke column that accidentally broke the lore. And if the world itself is a rigged arena, then the SBS is the shady commentator in the booth who keeps leaking the script as a joke. People call it filler, to which I say, mate, you're a filler, because as far as raw lore density goes, the SBS is basically a second manga hiding in the margins. Here's an interesting thing. The SBS did not start as the Vatican Library of One Piece. It's literally called Shitsumon o Boshu Suru, a goofy little we're accepting questions corner that began as Oda drawing dumb faces, answering what's Luffy's favorite food, and roasting children who ask about Nami's measurements. It was a gag column. We all treated it like the DVD blooper reel, and, to be fair, Oda encouraged that vibe. He answers in crayon energy. He doodles. He lies. He trolls. It feels like the least canon part of a very canon series, except he kept slipping in real answers, then bigger answers, then answers that quietly rewired the entire power system and world map. You want canon ages and birthdays. Half of them only exist in SBS. Want confirmation that fishmen and merfolk are distinct races with their own subcategories and interbreeding rules? SBS. The exact bounties of characters who never get a wanted poster panel? SBS. The revelation that Whitebeard's territory protection is an actual political structure, not just vibes? Again, SBS. We learn that Kid lost his arm to Big Mom's crew there. We get the first solid breakdown of the three-eye races and hints that the three-eye tribe can read poneglyphs. We find out what the D in Trafalgar Law's name stands for. Entire species, timelines, even how long it takes to sail between certain islands get clarified in what is, on paper, a joke corner about Sanji's eyebrow. And this is where iceberg charts go from fun graphic to SBS dependency spiral. Whole tiers are basically stuff Oda only said once, while answering a cursed drawing of Brook with hair. You think you know Elbaf just from the manga. The SBS adds cultural details, naming conventions, and ages that completely change how old some giants actually are. You think you understand devil fruit inheritance? SBS drops the idea of the will of the fruit, jumping to nearby objects. long before the manga really commits to it. I want to emphasize how wild this is as a canon strategy. Sometimes the SBS doesn't just add, it overrides. Early assumptions about Zoro's origin, Robin's bounty gap, even vague power-level ideas get quietly corrected. Suddenly, that background Marine you ignored has a full name, rank, and tragic backstory. But only if you read Volume 47's back pages. So when people say, I don't count SBS as real lore, to which I say, enjoy missing half the iceberg. Because as far as obscure backstories, failed drafts, and, wait, that's canon? World details go, Oda hides his sharpest knives in the comedy drawer. And if the SBS is the secret second manga, then the next layer down is even worse. The stuff that never made it into any book at all, only into prototypes and discarded versions of One Piece that Oda quietly cannibalized later. Vivre cards and data books, the canon behind the canon. But the SBS and prototypes are still Oda talking like a guy in sweatpants. The next layer down is when he puts on a lab coat and starts speed-running his own universe like it's a Pokédex. The data books, and especially the Vivre cards. These things are terrifying. On the surface, they're just merch binders. In practice, they're Oda and his editors trying to freeze a living, breathing manga into a neat little system. Ages, heights, blood types, affiliations, races, birthdays, bounties, even unseen techniques. It's like someone grabbed the entire world of One Piece, shoved it into Excel, and said, okay, now it's organized. To which I say, you have clearly never seen Oda draw a map. We had the early color data books first, red, blue, yellow, green, blue deep, each one pretending to be the definitive catalog, each one immediately outdated by the next arc. But the Vivre card series levels that up by being modular. You literally buy character cards in packs, like lore trading cards, and slot them into binders. You want every background Marine in Enia's lobby? Congratulations, they now have full names, ranks, and birthdays, and you're in too deep. Here's an interesting thing. A lot of the obscure but galaxy brain iceberg squares are just, like, one line from these cards. Ace's birthday lining up with Japanese fire wordplay, or Robin's birthday echoing for she/Shia death imagery, or a random character's date stealth matching a real-world historical coup. People will write 3,000-word void century essays off that. Are they overthinking it? Yes. Are we also doing that right now? Also, yes. The cards quietly confirm races and hometowns the manga only vaguely gestures at. Big Mom's kids get their species spelled out. Fishman District nobodies suddenly have canonical origins. We get bounty updates that never show up on panel, like post-Eni's lobby numbers for side characters, or confirmation that some pirate you thought was a gag actually has a terrifyingly high price on their head. Because as far as power scaling and political weight go, those numbers matter. And to be fair, this creates a mess. What happens when the manga and the data books clash? Early data books called Zoro a left-handed fighter. Then the story kept drawing him very not left-handed. Some Vivre card ages and heights quietly contradict older charts. An island might get a name in a data book, only for the manga to later reframe or ignore it. When iceberg compilers build their charts, they have to pick a canon. Manga first, reference second, is common. But if a wild theory needs that one data book line, suddenly it's, well, Oda approved it, so it's real. Take the background Marine example. That random guy behind Kobe in Marineford? In the Vivre cards, he's a fully named officer with a rank, birthplace, and combat specialty. or the unnamed islands, places that only ever appeared as blobs on a map panel, get official designations and climates in the books, expanding the geography way past what casual readers notice, which then lets people track routes, timelines, and even speculate which blank islands might hide ancient weapons. I want to emphasize, this is the canon behind the canon. It's not as loud as the manga, but it quietly dictates what's possible. And just when you think that's as deep as the rabbit hole goes, we hit the stuff that isn't even sold. Internal charts, editor memos, and production materials that leak out years later and blow up entire sections of the iceberg. Cover stories, side quests that secretly move the plot. And if the canon behind the canon lives in binders and editor memos, the other half lives in the one place most of us use to actively ignore, the cover pages. You know, the thing you flip past to get to the real chapter, to which I say, congratulations, you have personally delayed several major plot lines by about 5 seconds. Cover stories are those little serialized mini-arcs Oda runs on the chapter covers. On the surface, they're gag reels. Look, Walpole became a trash can entrepreneur. Look, Hatchin is doing takoyaki ASMR. It all feels like a vague slice-of-life B-roll, and because as far as weekly reading habits go, you're tired, it's Thursday, you kind of skim. And then 10 years later, Buggy shows up as a warlord, Enel is on the moon with an army of murder robots, and CP9 is randomly alive and doing calisthenics, and you realize the joke pages were actually a conveyor belt. Buggy's whole glow-up? Quietly charted in Buggy's Crew After the Battle, where we watch his scattered body parts and abandoned crew slowly reconverge. It takes ages, it's stupid, it's great, and it moves him into position to crash the Impel Down arc like the world's least qualified protagonist. Same with From the Decks of the World after Marineford, which literally functions as a global status report. Characters you forgot existed are being nudged one island over so they can matter again later. But here's an interesting thing. Some of these aren't just logistics. They're lore dumps wearing clown noses. Enel's great space operations starts as a meme about Lightning Man going to the moon. And to be fair, that sounds like a drunk SBS answer Oda turned into a bet. Then it quietly gives us an ancient civilization in the moon ruins, murals of winged people migrating down to the blue planet, and autonomous space tech that looks suspiciously like a proto-pacifista system. You get non-human races, old wars, and a visual timeline that plugs straight into Skypiea, Shandora, and maybe even the Void Century, all in what most readers assumed was a victory lap for Enel's abs. CP9's cover story does the same thing on a smaller scale. They're disgraced on the run, doing odd jobs, and somehow not executed by the government that allegedly erases failures. Why? Because the cover pages quietly reframe them as independent actors. So when Lucci strolls back in with CP0 clout, it doesn't feel like a raw retcon. We actually watch the career pivot, we just refuse to respect the medium. I want to emphasize, these pages are the connective tissue of the iceberg. They take what look like throwaway villains, background islands, or gag kingdoms, and thread them into the wider web. You only see the pattern if you're obsessively tracking every mini-arc, every logo in the background, every random ship name. And once you do, you start asking, if the joke pages are hiding ancient space history, what's hiding in the stuff Oda doesn't even print as comics anymore? Because the next layer isn't on a cover or in a volume, it's in the leaks, drafts, and production artifacts that were never meant to be part of the story at all. Background characters with canon lives, the extra you didn't notice. So here's the cursed revelation. Even the nobodies in One Piece are more accomplished than us. That guy you skim past in a marine crowd shot, he has a government job, a tragic childhood, and a favorite food. Because as far as Oda is concerned, there basically are no extras. He just litters the world with fully designed people the story doesn't strictly need. And then 5 years later goes, surprise! That bar patron you ignored is a revolutionary officer now. Fans call it foreshadowing. I call it getting jump-scared by a guy from chapter 120. Here's an interesting thing. A lot of these randoms are Marines. You'll see some vaguely stern dude behind Smoker in Logtown, forget him instantly. And then the Vivre card or an SBS drops like, yeah, that's name. He later becomes a vice admiral. He's from Specific Sea, age 41, specialty, anti-pirate tactics. The system quietly promotes them while we're not looking. Even guys like Strawberry, Yamakaji, or that one dude whose chin is 90% of his body start as background silhouettes at Marineford and then get full dossiers. The crowd is literally a spoiler list. And to be fair, it's not just uniform people. You've got bar patrons from early Grand Line arcs who randomly reappear in cover stories, now owning shops, raising kids, or joining the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. That one drunk in the corner? Congratulations, he's canonically running a shipping company. The cover stories are where Oda goes. Remember that gag design? Yeah, they have a mortgage and aspirations now. The revolutionaries are the funniest case. We meet them as vague blobs behind Dragon or Sabo, and the fandom's like cool silhouettes. Then years later, the Vivre cards and SBS answers go, actually, this one is from a kingdom you've never heard of. They specialize in espionage, and they're connected to a future rebellion you also haven't seen yet. It's like Oda is soft-launching characters in beta before the main release. I want to emphasize how absurd this gets once you bring in the Vivre card and SBS as iceberg fuel. You flip a card, and suddenly a dude who appeared in one panel on Jaya has a full name, hometown, age, bounty, and explicit ties to a bigger organization. Oda will casually reveal that some East Blue background Marine later joined SWORD, or that a random island civilian is actually from a nation that shows up post-time skip. People say, Oda plans everything, to which I say, he at least names everything, which is kind of scarier. And this is why the iceberg feels endless. Every crowd shot is potentially a landmine for an arc we haven't even entered yet. That's the real horror. You can't tell which face is a joke and which one is a time bomb. So the natural next question is, if the extras are this loaded, what happens when Oda starts hiding lore in people who technically don't even exist in the canon story yet? Unseen devil fruits, powers that exist only in footnotes. Because if background faces can be time bombs, the next escalation is obvious. What about powers that only exist in the margins? One Piece is the only series where you can get one shot by a devil fruit that technically lives in a Q&A corner. We're talking unseen devil fruits, not fan OCs, not headcanon, but powers that are canonized in 3 cursed categories: SBS answers, Vivre cards, and those weird cover story or background panels where a guy is clearly doing something impossible and Oda just never circles back. It's like the devil fruit system has DLC you can only access by reading the manual in Japanese. SBS fruits first. Oda will be answering, what's Zoro's favorite shampoo, and then casually drop, oh yeah, this character has a paramecia that lets them stitch anything together. We get stuff like the shika-deer fruit for that one background doctor, or Buggy's Bara being retroactively slotted into a whole taxonomy long before the word paramecia existed. The abilities are usually one sentence, kind of vague, but they lock in rules. If there's a fruit that can, say, store smells, that quietly justifies entire black market industries we never see, then Vivre cards take that chaos and spreadsheet it. You flip a data card, and suddenly some Marine Vice Admiral we've barely met is a confirmed devil fruit user with a model of some animal we've never seen on panel. You get named Zoans for random cipher-Paul agents, Logius for government big shots who never actually fight, and paramecias that sound like rejected JoJo stands. Here's an interesting thing, because as far as the system is concerned, those fruits exist, which means Oda has already pre-reserved that power space. If he ever wants a mud manipulation villain, he has to either use that guy or explain why there are two. Cover stories and background panels are the most cursed tier. You'll see a dude in a newspaper strip turning flat like a sheet of paper, or a janitor casually mopping with a liquid body, and it's never labeled. Fans go, "Is that a devil fruit or just cartoon physics?" To which I say, welcome to the real power system. These one-frame miracles are often later confirmed in Vivre cards, or SBS, retroactively telling you, yes, that random gag character was a canon paramecia all along. I want to emphasize how these off-panel fruits quietly patch world-building holes. You wonder how the world government moves information so fast? Somewhere in an SBS, Oda mentions a communications-adjacent fruit. You ask how ship repair, sky islands, or even newspaper distribution stay consistent. Odds are, a databook fruit user is doing unpaid labor in the background, and to be fair, it's kind of smart. The main story doesn't have time to stop for logia of efficient logistics, but the world still needs it. The scary part is what this implies for endgame pieces. If minor vice admirals and cover story randos are hiding unique fruits, what are the odds that a future Final War MVP has technically already been introduced as that guy in the corner with the weird hair? How many devil fruits are sitting in Vivre cards, waiting for Oda to cash them in when we hit Laugh Tale? And if powers can hide in footnotes, what about entire histories? Because the next layer down isn't just unseen fruits, it's events that only exist in offhand comments and half-erased maps. The dark corners of East Blue. Atrocities we only hear about once. And if powers can hide in footnotes, what about entire histories? Because as far as One Piece crimes go, East Blue is supposed to be the tutorial area. To which I say, what kind of tutorial comes with this many war crimes in the tooltips? Here's an interesting thing. When we go back to Arlong Park with Iceberg Brain, the arc stops being Nami sad, Luffy punch shark, and turns into a vague documentary about systemic occupation. Arlong doesn't just stroll in and bully one village. He's running a full colonial tax system. Monthly tribute, different rates for adults and children, execution if you fall behind. That's not a quirky villain rule, that's a codified structure someone has probably written down on a marine report as local stability fee. And to be fair, Oda never lingers on the logistics, but think about the line that Arlong has been doing this across islands for years. That implies entire maps of East Blue quietly bled dry, while the world government looks the other way because the numbers add up. Syrup Village is even darker when you stop laughing at Usopp's lies for 2 seconds. Kuro's whole plan is massacre the entire town in one night, forge a will, retire rich. The crew treats this like a standard operating procedure. They've done this before. We get that one offhand comment about previous villages wiped out, and the story just keeps moving. No names, no graves, just background data that there are ghost settlements in East Blue whose only narrative function is to prove this guy is serious. Bharati does the same thing with economic violence. Zeph's backstory is iconic, but buried in it is the idea that a single storm and one noble's whim can starve a whole crew to death. Jin casually mentions starving pirate bands, ships that never make it to the Grand Line, people sold or abandoned at random ports. It's treated as flavor text, but what he's describing is a floating gig economy where your boss can literally sell you into slavery at Logetown and no one blinks. I want to emphasize how many times early on we hear in one line about islands that don't exist anymore, families sold to pirates, or kingdoms that fell with zero elaboration. That's not just edgy seasoning. That's the narrative equivalent of crime scene photos taped over with a wanted poster. The joke is that East Blue is the weakest sea, but that only works because we don't see its worst atrocities on panel. The celestial dragons don't need to show up in person when their whole economic system already decides who gets taxed, who gets ignored, and who quietly disappears. And once you notice that gap between what's said and what's shown, the series' tone kind of tilts. If this is the sanitized sea, what does it look like when the camera finally follows those erased islands and missing families all the way up the red line? Because the next layer down is where the government stops outsourcing its brutality and starts doing it directly. Government Black Ops, the CP numbers you never met. This is the part where we all politely pretend CP9 and CP0 are the only cipher polls that matter, to which I say, that's adorable. Because as far as the world government is concerned, those guys are just the customer-facing brand. The real nightmare is the numbers we never actually meet. So, surface level. CypherPol is a whole system of government intelligence agencies, CP1 through CP8 operating legally, CP9 as the secret assassination arm, and CP0 directly under the Celestial Dragons as their personal hit squad. That's canon, stated flat out in Enia's lobby and reinforced in Dressrosa and Wano. The early numbered units are the ones with public offices, passports, and the kind of plausible deniability where they can say, "We're just investigators, sir," while quietly breaking your fingers under the table. But here's an interesting thing. We basically never see CP1 to 8 do anything on panel. We get CP5's Nero as a washed-up reject, CP6 and CP7 only mentioned in passing as former rivals to CP9, and that's it. For 8 whole branches of a globe-spanning superpower, that's suspiciously empty. It's like being told the Navy has an entire Air Force and then only ever meeting 2 guys with kites. The gaps get filled in by the weird stuff. In the cover stories, you get random government agents shadowing pirates in the background, or that one panel in the Enel cover story where a suited guy is taking notes on the sky people, like it's a colonial anthropology project. The data books quietly label certain unnamed suits as CP agents in places the manga never calls out, which implies these people are literally everywhere. You're reading a gag panel in a bar, and later the Vivre card goes, "Oh yeah, that guy was Black Ops." I want to emphasize how creepy that is, because if CP9 is the loud parkour murder squad, CP1 to 8 are probably the ones doing the boring, actually terrifying work. Long-term infiltration, economic sabotage, cleaning up witnesses after a buster call. Day to day, they're the reason a kingdom that refused tribute just happens to have a revolution 6 months later. They're the reason a scientist dies in an accident right after publishing a paper the Tenryubito wouldn't like. And to be fair, Oda never sits us down and says, yes, that shipwreck you saw 3 arcs ago was CP6. But once you know there is a formal, numbered network whose entire job is espionage and assassination, a lot of throwaway tragedies start reading like paperwork. Oh, that island vanished from maps? Cool world building? Or did CP2 falsify the charts? That royal family mysteriously disappeared at sea? Weird storm? Or a CP8 night op with a Sea King baiting fruit user we'll never meet? CP0 is just the mask ripped off. They're what happens when the celestial dragons stop pretending this isn't systemic. And the really fun question is, if the camera ever did follow CP1 to 8 for a full arc, would One Piece still feel like an adventure series? Or would it quietly become a horror story? Because the next layer down, we're not just talking about Black Ops suits. We're talking about the people who can erase an entire century and then make you thank them for the stability. Buster Calls and Erased Islands, the history we're not shown. Because as far as world-building war crimes go, One Piece kind of speedruns the nuclear age and then just looks away. We get told, very calmly, that the world government has a button that deletes islands, and the story treats it like a slightly spicy military option. Our one real on-screen case study is Ohara, Robin's home, the Tree of Knowledge, a whole island of nerds whose biggest crime was reading too hard. We actually watched the full Buster Call pipeline: investigation, evacuation lie, Sakazuki casually vaporizing a refugee ship just in case, and then that haunting spread of the island burning while the books sink. It's brutal, it's specific, it's personal. And to be fair, it's framed as this exceptional atrocity. But here's an interesting thing. The more you listen to Marines talk, the less exceptional it sounds. Spandine treats Ohara like paperwork. Sengoku and the elders discuss Buster Calls like you'd discuss budget cuts. The whole system is so routinized that they literally give a golden transponder snail to certain vice admirals as a panic button. You don't build a doomsday remote for a one-time event. We also have all these vague mentions of islands that no longer exist or vanished from the map. The West Blue incident that made Jaguar D. Saul a criminal? Never shown. The island that angered the dragons in Marineford chatter? No flashback. Even in Robin's backstory, the scholars talk about previous purges, previous disappearances, like Ohara is just the latest entry in a long, depressing bibliography. Data books and Vivre cards quietly back this up. They reference destroyed research sites, erased kingdoms, gaps in recorded sea routes that line up suspiciously well with void century topics. It's never labeled Buster Call every time, but functionally it's the same purge. Ships roll up, history goes boom, survivors get branded as devils. And I want to emphasize how powerful that is as a narrative tool. If you're the world government, and you can literally blow a civilization off the map, geography becomes censorship. Every blank patch of ocean, every unnamed ruin, is potentially not a mystery island, but a crime scene, which is extremely convenient when you're trying to hide ancient weapons blueprints, poneglyph routes, or the fact that your whole regime is sitting on a stolen century. So the map itself becomes this negative image. We can see the outline of what used to be there by looking at what's missing, which is kind of what the One Piece Iceberg is doing too. Fans are basically crowdsourcing an archaeological dig of absence, cataloging every offhand line, every SBS scrap, every "that island was wiped out" aside, and going, okay, what did they kill here and why? People say the iceberg is overthinking it, to which I say, yes, absolutely, but also that's the point. We're trying to reconstruct a world where the main antagonist's greatest power isn't the Marines or the Seraphim, it's successful deletion. And the deeper we go, the more we have to ask, what happens when that deletion starts to fail? Because there's one group in particular that keeps crawling out of those erased spaces, and the government cannot seem to kill the idea of them, no matter how many islands they burn. Void century breadcrumbs, the clues you stepped over, and the government cannot seem to kill the idea of them, no matter how many islands they burn. Which is awkward, because as far as the narrative goes, we've been tripping over their crime scene since East Blue, and just calling it world building. Here's an interesting thing. Before anyone says Void Century out loud, Oda is already screaming, something has been deleted, in tiny, polite fonts. Back in Logtown, Smoker calls the Great Age of Pirates a mistake that started with Roger's execution. That sounds like generic marine propaganda, right? To which I say, why is a random colonel talking like history itself glitched the moment one guy spoke on the scaffold? Then you get Nami's map obsession, the red line, and calm belt being this weird lock system, and suddenly the world feels designed to hide, not to connect. Robin is the obvious breadcrumb, but I want to emphasize how early her whole deal is framed as forbidden research, without the series giving us the vocabulary for it. In Whiskey Peak and Little Garden, Mr. 3 and Miss Golden Week joke about historians being dangerous. That's such a bizarre job to single out, unless Oda already knows that reading the wrong textbook is a capital crime. By the time Crocodile casually drops that Pluton's location is in an ancient text from a lost city, we've technically had our first Void Century weapon named. We just don't know that's what it is yet. Visually, the manga is doing the same thing. Alabasta's tombs have those big blocky pillars and sun disk motifs that will later rhyme with Shandora, with Fishman Island, with basically any place the government has tried and failed to fully sanitize. You get the recurring crescent moons on flags, on ruins, on random background architecture that your brain files under Oda likes circles, until Enel's moon adventure retroactively tells you, no, the moon is literally a plot-relevant country of origin. The world is a mess of disconnected islands, but the visual language is quietly saying, these people all went to the same cultural IKEA 800 years ago. And to be fair, Oda knows exactly what he's doing when he dodges. In one SBS, someone asks flat out about the Void Century, and he responds with that classic, I can't answer that yet, my editor will get mad, but then adds that he's already drawn the shape of that history, and just hasn't put in the colors. That is such a wild metaphor because it confirms the outline is locked, the retrofitting is in the shading. Another time, a fan asks if we'll ever see a detailed world map, and he laughs it off with, not until the straw hats are ready, which is a cute joke that accidentally confirms the map itself, the spoiler about what was erased. This is the pivot point on the iceberg. Up to now, we've treated each clue, an odd ruin here, a banned book there, as isolated trivia. From this layer down, we have to start acting like the archaeologists the story keeps killing, assembling a single, uncomfortable picture of an 800-year-old crime scene the series has actually been showing us from Chapter 1. And if these are the crumbs we noticed by accident, what about the ones we still haven't recognized as clues at all? Ancient weapons in the background, Pluton, Poseidon, and the one nobody talks about. So let's pull on one of those crumbs that is absolutely not a crumb, the ancient weapons. Because as far as the story is concerned, these are the 3 big red buttons you're never supposed to press, which obviously means Oda has been quietly leaving fingerprints on them everywhere. On the surface, the series is pretty generous. Pluton is a battleship blueprint so busted that just reading it should probably be a war crime. We're told it can wipe islands off the map. It's tied to Water 7, and the world government is terrified enough to burn a whole city over the idea. Poseidon is even clearer. Shirahoshi, a living mermaid interface to command sea kings, literally labeled in the text as Ancient Weapon Poseidon. Names, function, location, very user-friendly apocalypse. And to be fair, that's already a wild power system. One weapon is industrial engineering, the other is biopsychic ocean control. Then we hit Uranus, and the series just goes, yeah, that's a thing, and walks away. No design, no host, just a name dropped in Robin's Void Century info dump, and Imu may be pushing a big celestial delete key on Lulucia. People say, maybe that wasn't Uranus, to which I say, if it looks like a space laser and erases like a space laser, we're at least allowed to put it on the suspect board. Here's an interesting thing. Once you assume Uranus is sky or weather-based, a bunch of background weirdness stops being just Oda's geography being a mess. We have random enormous craters, like the one near God Valley's implied location, islands that look like they were scooped out of the planet, and then the red line itself getting a Mary Juaz-sized chunk punched through during the Reverie incident. Is that just narrative spectacle, or are we looking at test shots from an 800-year-old orbital cannon and the weather? This world's climate is not just quirky, it's broken. You've got permanent lightning islands, the calm belt acting like a natural prison, and Paradise's insane storm patterns. We're told the new world's weather is unpredictable, but it feels more like someone rewired the global thermostat with duct tape. If Poseidon is the ocean remote, Uranus starts to look like the atmosphere patch. Now fold in Sky Islands and ancient tech. Skypiea has dials that casually store wind, fire, and sound. Burka ruins are sitting up there like, yeah, we used to do advanced energy manipulation. Then Enel goes to the moon in a cover story, finds a literal robot army, and wall carvings of winged people leaving the moon for the blue planet with technology that predates the Void Century. That's not just cute lore, that's a migration of space engineers. I want to emphasize how quietly insane that is. We have a canon space civilization, automata, and power sources that look suspiciously like what you'd need for a planet-scale weather machine. The ancient weapons stop being just super weapons and start looking like infrastructure. Terraforming tools that got repurposed into guns. And if the same people who carved out Sky Islands and built moon robots also built Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, then that weird geography we talked about earlier might not be weird at all. It might be damage reports, which raises a nastier question. If those were the shots we can still see, what's missing that we can't? Because the next layer down is asking who pulled the trigger, and why the current world government is so desperate to keep us from recognizing the crime scene we're literally sailing across, the D Enigma, hidden bearers, and misleading clues. So, if the planet is a crime scene, the D people are basically the bloody fingerprints Oda left all over it. And the funny thing is, the fandom will go, yeah, Luffy, Roger, Teach, Law, we get it. To which I say, that's the tutorial level, because as far as the obvious Ds go, they almost distract you. Luffy, the smiling chaos engine, Ace, the tragic martyr, Garp, the goofy war criminal, Dragon, the eco-terrorist dad. Roger the Pirate Buddha, Blackbeard, the Walking Bug Report, Law the Goth Surgeon. Great. Pattern established. D's laugh in the face of God and die with a grin. Cool poster slogan, kind of useless as an actual theory. Here's an interesting thing. The pattern only gets weird when you start looking at the quieter carriers. Jaguar D. Saul, the giant archaeologist who literally tells a kid to laugh through the pain, vanishes in an O'Hara ice explosion and then shows up in a data book and cover story trail as, maybe, alive? Rox D. Zebek, never seen in the main story, but his name and crew are scattered across SBS, Vivre cards, and God Valley whispers like someone tried to delete him, and the narrative keeps glitching. Rouge, Porgas D. Rouge, whose whole role is to hold a pregnancy for 20 months just to smuggle a D past the world government's panic attack. And then we get the almost Ds and the meta-Ds. Tsuru is from the same North Blue region as Law, Corazon, and the Don Quixote mess, with data books quietly tying that sea to old royal lines and unusual incidents in the Void Century. The monkey family is locked to Dawn Island, which keeps getting framed as this strangely important, strangely average place. SBS Answers will casually say things like, "Oh, this region used to be something special," and then never elaborate, like Oda is speed-running redaction. I want to emphasize how many non-D characters are basically spiritually decoded. Sabo shares Luffy's dream, inherits the hat for a bit, and literally picks up Ace's will without ever getting the middle initial. Vivi is a princess who defies the world government, rides with a pirate crew and is now central to an ancient weapon plotline, and to be fair, her family's history screams, "We used to be part of something bigger." Even someone like Kobe, framed as Luffy's marine mirror, keeps stumbling into key events, changing the system from inside instead of blowing it up. So what does that say about the will of D? At this point, it starts looking less like a bloodline tag and more like a job description. The initial is a shortcut, but the real D is a role in the story's operating system. People who destabilize the fake peace and reconnect the world to whatever it used to be. And once you see it that way, the D, the Void Century, and the planet's broken structure stop being three mysteries. They start feeling like three different error messages from the same deleted update. Which raises the next question. What original version of the world was so dangerous that someone tried to uninstall it from history? The Cypher Pole Shadow War. Assassins hiding in early panels. So if somebody tried to uninstall an entire version of reality, who actually clicked the button? Because as far as the manga is concerned, the answer is a bunch of guys in suits who keep photobombing panels you never looked at twice. Cypher Pole is Oda's way of telling us the world is a surveillance state long before he says the words CP9. Early on, CP5 and CP7 are played like jokes, right? Lucci roasting Nero, the goofy bureaucrats in Water 7, all that. It feels like, ha, government weirdos. To which I say, that's exactly how a horror movie starts. You laugh at the clown before it pulls out the knife. Because once CP9 drops, the tone flips from office comedy to, "We legally erase your hometown." And by the time CP0 shows up, they're basically ghost stories in top hats. Here's an interesting thing. Oda seeds that vibe way earlier than Enies Lobby. Go back to Logtown. You've got random suited guys in the crowd when Dragon appears, watching the execution platform and not reacting like normal, terrified civilians. Vivre cards and data books quietly flag some of these background nobodies as government-affiliated. Same deal in Whiskey Peak. agents in sunglasses taking notes during the feast, a couple of silhouettes that reappear in Baroque works Intel spreads. It reads as crowd filler until you realize the crowd is literally ochar for world fascism. And to be fair, Oda even dips into East Blue. There are panels in places like Shellstown and Orangetown with clean-cut, hat-brimmed bystanders who later get recycled as generic cipher pole designs. Is every one of them a confirmed agent? No, but he's teaching you visually. The government is always in the room, even when the plot doesn't say Marine. Once you see that pattern, the whole series starts to feel like a Where's Waldo book, except Waldo can legally Buster call you. This also retroactively fixes a bunch of wow, that was convenient moments. Robin's first bounty jumps to 79 million at age 8. That's not a bounty. That's a memo. It's the world government telling every underworld broker, this kid is classified material. Igaram's mission in Alabasta suddenly looks less like a paranoid king sending one loyal captain and more like a sanctioned intelligence op piggybacking on Baroque Works network. And the Marines' absurd response time? Luffy punches a celestial dragon, and suddenly the whole Sabaody archipelago is a boss rush. That feels like bad pacing until you assume Cipher Pol has been updating threat levels in real time. I want to emphasize how much of the story actually happens off-panel once you factor these guys in. Ohara's destruction is framed as a single Buster call, but CP9 and CP0 exist to do the pre-work. Identify scholars, track poneglyph movements, bury Pluton intel inside layers of false blueprints. Wano is closed, yet CP0 strolls in with Kaido-era trade deals and up-to-date intel on samurai politics. The real plot is in the margins, reports being written, witnesses disappearing, maps being edited. And if Cipher Pol is the visible tip of that Black Ops iceberg, what about the people even they're scared of? The Buster Call Industrial Complex, erased islands and missing maps. Those people even Cipher Pol is scared of. They're the ones who can delete your hometown so hard the map forgets it existed. One Piece loves its big, loud wars, but the real horror story is the quiet, administrative genocide. So, Buster Call. Publicly, we're told it's this ultra-rare, last-resort nuke. We see Ohara, the Aeneas lobby attempt, and a couple of vague mentions that it's been used a few times in the past on particularly nasty pirates. That's the official script, to which I say, if this is the Navy's red button, why does everyone from Spandine to random vice admirals talk about it, like it's just Tuesday paperwork? The power is absurd. 10 warships, 5 vice admirals, full bombardment until the island is functionally a parking lot. And, to be fair, Ohara alone proves it works. An entire civilization of scholars erased. The world is told. Tragic incident, tree caught fire, whatever PR spin they slapped on it. But here's an interesting thing. Once you start looking at the maps and the data books, you run into this weird pattern of places that feel cropped out. We get named but never seen islands like Fron Island from early materials, or minor blues islands that show up once in a Vivre card and then quietly vanish from later charts. Some SBS answers mention a kingdom that used to be here without ever clarifying what happened. Because as far as geography goes, the One Piece world is a mess. The official maps have awkward gaps in the Grand Line routes, stretches of nothing that make no logistical sense for a trade-based world. Data books will talk about certain locations in the past tense, like, this island was prosperous, with zero follow-up. You don't say was in a setting where we constantly revisit old arcs unless you're signaling something. Combine that with the fact that we know the government will annihilate an island just for reading the wrong rock, and suddenly those missing tech hubs, those offhand mentions of ancient labs, start to look very Buster Call-shaped, because the fear is the real weapon. You don't actually need to fire the Buster Call every week. You just need enough stories of an island that angered the government and then stopped existing. People don't know the details. They just know that somewhere out there, ships came, cannons fired, and a whole culture turned into rumor. Would you rebel if you thought your entire bloodline could be turned into a cautionary tale? I want to emphasize, not everything missing is void century. Some of it feels modern, systematic erasure. Why are there almost no surviving centers of advanced pre-Vegapunk technology? Why do so many cultures feel like they're first generation with no layered ruins beneath them? It's very convenient for the world government if every time a place starts accumulating dangerous knowledge, a natural disaster happens, and if islands can be erased that cleanly, what else can be rewritten? Borders, lineages, even the idea of what the world used to look like? Keep that in mind when we talk about the one place they physically cannot redraw on the map. Impel Down's forgotten levels. What's below level 6? So, if the world government can literally delete an island, redraw a coastline, and pretend nothing ever existed there, what do you do with the one landmark you can't erase because it's bolted into the middle of the ocean? You don't move it. You build a prison on top of it and call it Impel Down. On the surface, Impel Down looks very neat as a system. Level 1, Spiky Hell. Level 2, Murder Zoo. Level 3, Starvation Sauna. Level 4, Lava Crunch. Level 5 and 5.5, Blizzard and Gay Jailbreak. Level 6, the You Don't Get Screen Time Anymore floor. It escalates cleanly. It's thematically fun. It's Oda doing Dante's Inferno with more poison and sphinxes that tell dad jokes. But here's an interesting thing. The deeper we go, the less the architecture makes sense. The prison is a vertical tower in the Calm Belt, surrounded by sea kings, but the interiors start looking less like a purpose-built government facility and more like somebody carved rooms out of something already there. Random uneven caverns, weird stonework, that massive central shaft that feels too big even for Oda's usual scale issues. It's like they dropped a bureaucratic IKEA catalog on top of an ancient ruin and said, "Yeah, that's fine." And to be fair, Oda could have just drawn cool caves, because caves are cool. But Magellan and Hannibal keep making comments about restricted areas and orders from above in a prison that is supposedly already the bottom of the world. Restricted from what exactly? The poison man who literally runs hell is somehow not top of the food chain down there. Which brings us to Level 6, the Eternal Red Flag. We're told these are criminals so bad their names are erased from history. Except we never actually hear most of their crimes. Sure you. Too violent. Doflamingo's hinted for a spot because of what he knows. Jinbe is there for refusing to fight Whitebeard, which is not exactly serial killer behavior. That's not a punishment scale. That's a political filter. People aren't just jailed for actions. They're jailed for knowledge, loyalties, bloodlines. Because as far as the void century goes, that's exactly what the world government is terrified of. Fans like to say, well, level 6 is the bottom. That's the point. To which I say, have you seen the diagrams? Some official materials draw Impel Down with vague, shaded space under level 6, like the artist was told. Just don't define that part. The prison is literally sitting in the sea. Yet we never see a fully submerged level, no flooded oubliettes, no pressure chambers. In a series obsessed with the ocean prison somehow doesn't use the ocean. So the popular theory is there's a sealed or submerged layer beneath level 6, maybe multiple. Something Magellan doesn't control, that even most Marines only know as classified Foundation data. I want to emphasize how on-brand that would be. We already have Maria Joie built on top of the mysterious Land of the Gods. We have ancient weapons hidden under kingdoms. Reusing a pre-world government fortress or lab as a prison is exactly this world's aesthetic. Impel Down then stops being just the place Luffy broke into that one time and becomes an ancient installation that the world government wrapped in barbed wire because they couldn't destroy it. The deepest cells might not hold pirates at all, but relics, failed experiments, or even people from bloodlines that predate the celestial dragon's rule. And if that's true, then the scariest thing in Impel Down isn't the prisoners we met. It's the ones we were never allowed to see. Locked under a floor the manga pretends doesn't exist. Keep that image in your head when we talk about the other great world government monument that absolutely should not be where it is. The Revolutionary Army's ghost cells, failed uprisings, you never hear about, because if Impel Down is the world government's basement, then the other monument that shouldn't exist is their haunted attic, the Revolutionary Army. On paper, the Revos look clean. We're told there's Dragon at the top, Sabo as chief of staff, then regional commanders like Karasu, Morley, Lindbergh, Bello Betty, each covering whole seas. We see Baltigo, then Momoiro, then the Kamabaka HQ shuffle. We see big splashy ops, the Dressrosa weapons pipeline, the Lulutia Kingdom liberation, the Reverie infiltration. It feels like a tight power system, to which I say, that's the PR brochure. That's the LinkedIn page of a group that should statistically be getting annihilated every Tuesday. Because as far as actual on-page results go, we almost never see them fail. And to be fair, that's kind of suspicious. Oda loves losers. We watch pirates get clowned constantly. Marines get humbled. But the Revolutionary Army? Their losses mostly live in negative space in throwaway lines and half-visible newspaper panels. Here's an interesting thing. Go back through cover stories and background headlines. You'll spot vague blurbs like Rebellion Quelled in X Country or Kingdom Restored After Insurgency. At the time, you probably read that as world-building wallpaper. But once the Revos are a known quantity, those start to look like crime scene photos. Not every rebellion is Luffy walking in with a punchable face and plot armor. Some of those are absolutely ghost cells, tiny revolutionary branches that got found, flipped, or erased before we could ever learn their flag. Think about places that scream, "Please overthrow me," and then nothing. The Goa Kingdom has a literal garbage inferno and nobles burning people alive. And we know Dragon was there recruiting. How many Gray Terminal kids tried to follow him and just never made it out of East Blue? The island where Gin and Krieg washed up, with starving pirates and a wrecked economy, feels like it should be fertile ground for Dragon's pitch. Instead, we get a one-arc villain and silence. Even in Paradise, you have random impoverished kingdoms in cover stories begging for food, but no epic revolution, just a one-line mention that the riots were put down. I want to emphasize how dark that implication is. For every Lulusia that gets liberated, there are probably 5 Lulusias that ended with Cypher Pole doing a 3 a.m. door knock and a mass grave we'll never see. The world government doesn't just ignore sedition. they industrialize counterinsurgency. That's where Dragon's mystique starts looking less like pure hype and more like narrative sleight of hand. We're shown the symbolic wins, the flags burning, the cheering crowds, the cool commanders posing on rubble. The brutal, forgotten losses are pushed off panel, mentioned as unrest or cleanup. It keeps Dragon feeling like this unstoppable storm, while quietly admitting his movement is hanging on by its fingernails. And if the Revolutionary Army is already bleeding out in the margins during peacetime, what happens when the world government finally decides to stop playing defense? The children of Punk Hazard, off-screen experiments, and lost subjects. And when the world government stops playing defense, it doesn't just send battleships, it sends science projects. Punk Hazard looks like a one-arc horror movie we can neatly file away. Scary gas clown, big kids, everyone cries, smoker coughs up blood, we move on. To which I say, we are absolutely the rushed system here, because as far as One Piece atrocities go, this one is way too structured to be a one-off mess. Here's an interesting thing about the Punk Hazard kids that people kind of gloss over. They're not one age group. You've got toddlers, elementary schoolers, preteens, and kids old enough to remember their homes, their islands, even specific promises their parents made. Different clothes, different dialects, different seas. That's not one village raid. That's a supply chain. Multiple abductions over years, funneled into one research program that's already mid-experiment when we arrive. And to be fair, Oda actually leans into the logistics if you stare at the background art too long. The cages, the color-coded uniforms, the medical charts, the sedative schedules, the fact that some kids are already massive while others are new arrivals. How many shipments had come through before the Straw Hats crashed the party? How many Marine reports got quietly refiled as children lost at sea because it was politically convenient? We're told Caesar is working for himself, but he's literally building on Vegapunk's old gigantification notes, on a world government island with a history of government gas weapons testing. The kids are getting NHC-10, a drug that creates dependence and distorts growth, in the same series where we've already seen unnaturally huge humans, failed giants like Little Oars Jr., and weirdly modified bodies hanging around the new world like it's normal. At some point, you have to ask, how many of those natural giants and monsters are just the successful prototypes that walked off the slab? I want to emphasize how retroactively creepy this becomes once we meet characters like the Numbers on Onigashima, or see Moria playing Frankenstein with corpses, or get SBS clarifications about abnormal lifespans and hybrid races. Punk Hazard is not an exception. It's the one lab that got caught. The government tried to scale up giants, soldiers, drugs, even kids' loyalty. And every time something went wrong, they just moved the project to a new island and called the last batch a sunk cost. And for every child we see begging Tashigi not to send them back, how many never made it to that stage? How many were quietly disposed of when the dosages went bad, or repurposed into units like the Numbers, or are still out there right now, half-grown, chemically dependent, and completely unaccounted for? People joke that Caesar is the worst scientist in the series, but the really terrifying idea is that he's just the sloppiest, the one whose failures we actually saw, which raises a very simple, very uncomfortable mystery box for later arcs. If this is what the B-team was doing on a ruined island nobody's supposed to visit, what kind of human experimentation program do you run when you have Vegapunk's brain, Mary Joyce's budget, and 0 witnesses? And if Punk Hazard is just the prototype, What happens when we finally visit the places where the experiments worked? The devil fruit black market, powers that never reached the story. So if Punk Hazard is the prototype human weapon lab, the next uncomfortable question is, where do all the successful weapons go when you don't want them walking around on panel? And the answer is this weird, half-seen ecosystem that One Piece keeps hinting at, the devil fruit black market. We watch people eat devil fruits all the time, but we almost never watch the fruits move. As far as the story we actually see goes, a fruit just kind of pops into existence next to the person who needs a new power and boom, destiny. But step back and think about the logistics for 2 seconds. Pirate crews like Blackbeard's are actively hunting fruits. The world government keeps official stockpiles. Yonko like Kaido and Big Mom are hoarding them like Pokemon cards. That implies ships, brokers, warehouses, failed deals, the whole messy supply chain we never get. Dressrosa is the one arc that pulls the curtain a little. Doflamingo isn't just a warlord, he's literally the central broker for Smiles, artificial Zoans being pumped from Punk Hazard to Kaido. We see the factory, the distribution, the auctions in Sabayori, where fruits are just another luxury good next to slaves. And to be fair, that's only the clown-colored tip of the iceberg. Because, as far as implied infrastructure goes, you don't build an entire Smile operation if you don't already have a parallel market for real fruits running quietly in the background. Big Mom takes that to the extreme. Her whole collection gimmick basically screams, "I have a spreadsheet of every devil fruit on Earth." She trades, steals, and inherits fruits through her crew, and we know she's willing to kill her own children to recycle powers. That means there are fruits sitting in chests, vaults, and candy-coated fortresses that never make it to the main narrative. Powers that might be absurdly broken and are just off-screen investments. Here's an interesting thing. The Vivre cards and databooks casually confirm fruits we've never seen used in the manga. Background marines with specified paramecias. No-name pirates whose only canon appearance is a crowd shot. But the card says, "Oh yeah, he has the whatever no mai." I want to emphasize how wild that is. There is a whole parallel devil fruit meta that only exists inside material, like Oda is running a secret gotcha game behind our backs. So what does it mean that some powers are effectively locked away? One reading is just author brain. Oda likes the idea, parks it in a Vivre card, maybe he'll redeem it later. But there's a more fun in-universe read. The fruits are being deliberately suppressed. Logias are already rare, and the really busted paramecias tend to end up with people who matter to the balance of power. When the Gorosei talk about certain powers that can't be allowed to exist, to which I say, that's stock market language. They're not just erasing people, they're buying out volatile assets before they crash the system. And if the government and the Yonko are quietly scooping up anything too destabilizing, that raises an even darker question. How many fruits, how many potential gods and monsters have already been erased so cleanly that all we get is a stray data book line and a suspicious gap in history? Right next to the Void Century, the Lost Warlords, and prototype Shichibukai system. So if the government is out here quietly deleting devil fruits like they're bad tweets, we kind of have to talk about the other big, curated list in this world, the 7 warlords. Because as far as public-facing propaganda goes, the Shichibukai are basically a Marvel crossover poster taped over a crime scene. On paper, we know the lineup changes. Crocodile gets yeeted for trying to coup Alabasta. Moria, allegedly too weak. Jinbe jailed for not playing nice at Marineford. Blackbeard Rage quits the program in record time. Law joins. Doflamingo loses his job and his spinal integrity. Buggy and Weevil slide in as the comedy and horror picks. But here's an interesting thing. Even with all that, the timeline has weird gaps where the roster should be 7, and just isn't. We have eras where we can account for maybe 5 or 6 names, and the story just kind of shrugs. Vivre cards and databooks will say stuff like, the warlord system was established long ago without pinning a year, and Oda dodges specifics in SBS with jokes about editorial red tape. People say, oh, he just hadn't decided yet, to which I say, sure, sometimes. But this man also knew to seed Shanks's haki in Chapter 1. When he leaves a blank, it's usually doing double duty as both writing flexibility and an in-universe cover-up. If we line up known events, the system has to predate the great age of piracy boom by a decent margin. You don't recruit Crocodile, Moria, Jinbe, and Mihawk out of nowhere. That implies earlier test runs, earlier trusted pirates, and probably earlier disasters. The government's whole idea is weaponize fear while outsourcing costs. You really think they nailed that on attempt number 1? Now look at the failed warlord archetypes walking around. Guys like Doflamingo before his official appointment, running Dressrosa like a shadow kingdom while chatting directly with CP0. Rouge quietly wrecking a Yonko commander, camping out on a sky island no one regulates. Even someone like Crocodile's pre-Alabasta phase, with a massive bounty and that vague, suspiciously unspoken incident in his past. These are people who feel tailor-made for backroom deals. Some probably got offers, some probably took them, some probably ended up as tragic accidents at sea. And I want to emphasize, One Piece is full of legendary monsters we only ever hear about in rumor. Rock's crew members we never fully meet. Unnamed pirates who challenged the world government and vanished. Islands wiped off maps between editions. It's not hard to imagine a prototype Shichibukai who went so far off script that the safest move was to erase their name, downgrade them into a campfire story, and pretend the system was always this clean, this controllable. Because if the warlords are the success stories they're willing to admit to, what does one of the failures look like? And what if we've already seen the scorch marks of one of those lost monsters on an island that technically doesn't even exist anymore? The Calm Belt ecosystem, ancient life preserved by design, on an island that technically doesn't even exist anymore. Cool, so let's talk about the other thing that doesn't exist. The ocean that wraps the world like a dead aquarium. The Calm Belt gets pitched to you as a simple navigational debuff. No wind, no currents, just an all-you-can-eat straw hat buffet for sea kings. But as far as One Piece oceans go, it is suspiciously well-behaved. The Grand Line is a weather war crime, the blues are relatively normal, and then you have these two perfectly still bands copy-pasted around the globe like someone drew them with a ruler. Here's an interesting thing. Natural systems hate that kind of stability. We get freak lightning, sky islands, literal flame clouds, and then 2 zones where the wind just collectively clocks out forever. The Calm Belt feels less like nature and more like a setting in the world's options menu that somebody turned to off. And inside that frozen little slider bar, we get the Sea Kings. Not just big fish, but ancient, borderline mythic megafauna. The same class of creature that Poseidon is prophesied to command. The same voices of all things animals that supposedly remember the void century. It starts to look less like a random hazard and more like a time capsule. If the rest of the world got churned up by whatever ended the ancient kingdom, where do you park the stuff you don't want to lose? Somewhere isolated, stable, and patrolled by kaiju that can snack on battleships. People say, well, it's just so the Grand Line is hard to enter, to which I say, sure, but Oda could have done that with storms and whirlpools. He already did that multiple times. The Calm Belt is overkill. It's a vault. And to be fair, it's a vault that certain people clearly have the password to. The Marines casually roll out sea stone-coated hulls that nullify Sea King attention like they toggled off random encounters. That tells us two things. One, they've studied this ecosystem enough to reverse engineer its aggro rules. Two, they use it. You don't invest in Calm Belt safe logistics unless you're treating that space as a hidden highway. Meanwhile, Amazon Lily is just chilling there. An entire nation thriving in the middle of impossible to reach, with Kuja, who treats sea kings like mildly annoying seagulls. I want to emphasize how bizarre that combo is. The world government has secret tech to cross. The Kuja have cultural techniques to live there. Everyone else gets eaten. That's not just geography, that's access control. So what are they actually guarding? If the Red Line and Grand Line cross pattern is an engineered prison system, the Calm Belt is the moat. Underneath that glassy surface, you can easily imagine buried weapon platforms, failed ancient kingdom outposts, even whole cities sunk and then locked behind a wall of monsters and stillness. Why does no one seriously map the seafloor there? Why do we never hear about failed excavation expeditions? Because as far as narrative red flags go, the world's calmest, most dangerous place that everyone avoids, while two superpowers quietly master it, is screaming that something is down there. And if the Sea Kings are the preserved guardians of the old world, the next question is brutal. What happens when someone finally convinces them to move? And speaking of oceans that shouldn't exist, there's one more body of water that breaks the world map even harder than the Calm Belt. The Red Line as a man-made barrier, geological evidence in plain sight. So if the Calm Belt is already screaming, this ocean was patched in with duct tape, the Red Line is the part of the map where Oda just slammed a Minecraft world border through the planet and called it a day. It's a single, continuous, perfectly vertical wall of continent that wraps the entire globe like someone drew a line with the rectangle tool. And, to be fair, One Piece is allowed to be weird. But here's an interesting thing. Real tectonic plates do not do this. Continents fracture, curve, break into archipelagos. They don't form one razor-straight equatorial plus meridian ring that just so happens to divide the seas into four neat blues and one chaotic grand line. The climates it touches are a mess, too. You've got frozen drum, tropical Alabasta-adjacent regions, and whatever the hell is going on near Maria Joie, all smashed against the same rock face with no gradual transition. That's not geology, that's level design. People will say, okay, but maybe that's just fantasy world building. To which I say, sure, except Oda keeps drawing it like infrastructure. Look at Maria Joie. It's not some random mountain peak. It's this eerily flat plateau, perfectly centered at the top of the world, with symmetrical gates, elevators, and a highway system for celestial dragons. The Red Line doesn't just host Maria Joie, it presents Maria Joie like the whole landmass was prepped as a throne room. Then you've got the holes in the wall. Fishman Island is literally a massive tunnel drilled straight through the Red Line, with a bubble membrane interface and pressure controls like someone installed an undersea airport. The Florian Triangle is framed as this Bermuda Triangle horror zone, but its position relative to the Red Line and the Grand Line currents reads like a deliberately broken traffic circle. Because as far as ocean circulation goes, the Grand Line and calm belts already defy basic physics. Adding these suspiciously convenient routes feels less like nature and more like somebody patched escape hatches into their giant prison wall. I want to emphasize how thematically on brand that would be. We already accept Noah, a ship the size of a city that can be dragged by sea kings. We accept Pluton as a nation-deleting war machine, the sea train casually rewriting ocean travel, and Enel's Arc Maxim as a DIY sky laser. Continent-scale terraforming is just that same engineering obsession zoomed out. If oars can drag islands and Zunatia can walk continents, carving the Red Line or reshaping it isn't outlandish. It's the logical next escalation of the series' power tools. And once you let yourself see the Red Line as at least partially artificial, the whole world map snaps into a much darker idea. This is a containment grid. The four blues are isolated cell blocks. The calm belt is the electric fence. The Grand Line is the internal corridor where all the really dangerous inmates circulate. And Marie-Joie is the warden's office built right on the load-bearing wall, which then raises the uncomfortable question we'll have to talk about next. If the world is a prison, who built it, and what exactly are they so afraid of getting out? The Florian Triangle and maritime ghost stories turned real. If the world is a prison, the Florian Triangle is that one hallway the guards don't patrol. The cameras cut out, and everyone just pretends it doesn't exist. On paper, it's a gag zone. In practice, it's the first time One Piece quietly says, "Hey, what if the ocean itself is wrong?" Surface level, we know the bit. Endless fog, zero visibility, that oppressive silence, and then these absolutely massive silhouettes sliding by in the mist, like somebody left the kaiju DLC turned on. Derelict ships everywhere, masts snapped, hulls rotting, whole crews gone. And then the punchline is Thriller Bark, which is literally a Scooby-Doo episode that got drunk and fell into a Tim Burton movie. Zombies, a cartoonish mad scientist, a talking skeleton with afrophysics that defy every known power system. It's horror comedy so loud that you kind of stop looking at the background. But here's an interesting thing. Even once you strip away the gags, some stuff never actually gets explained. Those giant shadowy figures, they are not Thriller Bark. Thriller Bark is big, but it's not blot out the horizon and dwarf marine warships big. The number of wrecks in that fog is absurd, way beyond bad weather lane. And to be fair, this is a world where people casually ride sea kings to work, but even hardened Grand Line crews treat the Triangle like a death sentence. You don't get veteran pirates spooked by a meme. People like to say, well, it's just Oda wanting a spooky arc, to which I say, sure, but Oda doesn't usually waste environmental weirdness, because as far as the Grand Line goes, everything strange tends to plug back into some rule. Magnetic fields, log poses, crazy weather, calm belt biology. The Triangle feels like that system having a nervous breakdown. Compasses don't work right, fog never lifts, and ships vanish without a clear culprit. That starts to sound less like haunted ocean, and more like a region where space, magnetism, and maybe even time are slightly misaligned. You can very easily imagine this being collateral damage from ancient tech or a devil fruit awakening gone wrong. Failed weather control experiments that permanently scrambled the currents. A space-distorting ability that left a scar. So now ships are kind of half-phased between locations and never make it back. I want to emphasize how neatly that would rhyme with other anomalies. Knock-up streams, calm belts, even the bizarre sky islands that just exist. And the Florian Triangle doesn't sit alone. We already have sea monster legends, ghost ships like the Rumbar Pirate's fate, cursed routes nobody charts anymore. The Triangle feels like one of several maritime hotspots where the world's underlying unnatural rules bleed through the surface narrative a little too hard, and reality stops pretending to be normal. If the calm belt is the government-approved danger, this is the off-the-books glitch, which raises a quieter, much creepier question we'll circle back to. If these hotspots are scars, what exactly wounded the ocean badly enough to leave them? Cover story. Conspiracies. The arc's happening. While you blink, if those ocean scars are the big, loud glitches, cover stories are the quiet ones. They're the parts of the iceberg you literally flip past on the way to the real chapter, to which I say, congratulations, you've just skipped an entire parallel season of One Piece. Because as far as structure goes, cover stories are Oda running side campaigns while the main party is busy. On the surface, they're gag postcards. Pell feeds birds. Wapol is homeless now, LOL. But then you get things like Hachi's seafloor stroll, which casually walks a joke fishman out of Arlong Park, gives him a love life, a takoyaki stand, and then parks him right in front of Kami and Papag, so Sabaody can even happen. If you didn't read that, Hachi just teleports back into relevance, and the world feels like a vague mess. Here's an interesting thing. Enel on the moon. You finish Skypiea, you think, okay, lightning guy blasted off, funny Looney Tunes ending. The cover story quietly says, actually, he found an ancient moon city, fought space robots, and discovered that the moon people are literally the ancestors of Skypians, Shandians, and Birkins. That's not a joke, that's a void, century-adjacent lore dump hiding behind the logo. Caribou's cover story does the same kind of war crime. Dude is introduced as swamp filler, and suddenly he's in a revolution-torn island, meeting Gaburu, getting captured by Drake, and, crucially, leaking that Shirahoshi is Poseidon to a mysterious certain someone tied to Kaido. If you skip that, Wano's information network just magically knows an ancient weapon exists. The power system of information in this world literally runs through the margins. And to be fair, Oda keeps rewarding the people who treat these like canon episodes. We see what happened to Baroque works after Alabasta, with Mr. Two's sacrifice and the Impel Down setup. CP9's We Definitely Died moment is undercut by a cover story where they survive, get framed, and become rogue agents, which recontextualizes every later government black ops. The spread of the Straw Hat flag through villages, ships, and even random bars? Mostly cover story imagery. That's how you feel the crew becoming a symbol while the main plot is busy punching one island at a time. I want to emphasize, some of the scariest setup still hasn't fully paid off. We've seen suspicious factories churning out weapons and weird goods, islands that only exist in these little vignettes, and alliances between nobodies who suddenly don't look like nobodies anymore post-Reverie. Are those just jokes, or are they the first drafts of the final war map? People say One Piece is tightly planned, to which I say it's more like Oda is juggling a dozen campaigns at once. While the Straw Hats crawl through one arc, everyone else is leveling up off-screen, and the cover stories are the DM notes we're barely allowed to read, which raises an even dumber, bigger question we'll get to later. If this is what he's willing to show us in the gutters, what's still happening completely off-panel. The moon, automata, and the lost space civilization. And if the cover stories are the DM notes, then Enel's moon trip is the page where the DM accidentally left the entire campaign Bible in the printer. People love to treat that cover story like a gag vacation, to which I say, you don't draw a full sci-fi origin myth in weekly serialization just for a bit. Quick recap, because as far as obscure lore goes, this is S tier. Enel gets yeeted into space, lands on the moon, blows a hole in it with lightning, and discovers ancient ruins. Inside, a buried city, a whole army of little automata, and, most importantly, murals. These murals literally show a civilization living on the moon, running out of resources and descending in ships to the blue planet. That's not a cute doodle. That is Oda quietly saying, by the way, One Piece is post-spacefaring. Here's an interesting thing. The tech here is not some random steampunk mess. The automata look like early prototypes of Karakuri Island's robots. The city structures echo the design language of the Noah and even the Arc Maxim. The murals show 3 winged tribes that look exactly like Skypians, Shandians, and Birkins. It's a full tech and culture package, just off-planet. I want to emphasize how wild that is for the larger system of the world. We already have indestructible poneglyphs made with a lost technique, a gigantic ship like Noah built with unknown engineering, and then, centuries later, Vegapunk is the greatest genius in history for kind of reverse engineering scraps of this stuff. The idea that all of these are actually fragments of one continuous technological lineage that started on the moon makes way too much sense. And to be fair, this retroactively upgrades Skypiea from fun Cloud Arc with dial gimmicks to crucial migration chapter. Those sky races aren't just quirky angel people. They're literally the descendants of lunar refugees who didn't make it all the way down. That weird map of the moon in the Enel covers, it labels the ancient city as Birka. Birka, as in Enel's home in the sky. So now Skypiea reads like the story of a splinter colony of space migrants who forgot they were from space. Which leaves us with the fun part. All the questions Oda refuses to answer. Why was the moon abandoned? Resource depletion is the vague in-universe explanation. But what does that mean in a world with endless clouds and weather science that can literally move islands? What powered the automata for centuries? And why do they reactivate when Enel zaps the ruins? Are we looking at some ancient electricity-based power system that predates even Nika's goofy rubber god routine? And if the world government is willing to erase 100 years of history on the sea, does that censorship extend to space itself? Are they actively suppressing evidence of a lost spacefaring age because it breaks their whole "this is the natural order" narrative? We'll come back to that when we talk about the Void Century's great kingdom, because if that kingdom had friends on the moon, the endgame map just got a lot bigger. The Poneglyph Network, messages that don't want to be found, and if the world government is terrified of people looking up at the moon, they are absolutely petrified of people looking down at the ground and reading, because as far as narrative horror goes, the scariest thing in One Piece isn't an ancient weapon, it's a rock with good handwriting. Here's an interesting thing. The poneglyphs are allegedly a record of history, right? That sounds cozy. Library vibes. But then you actually map them and it feels less like a library and more like a rage-quit scavenger hunt designed by a paranoid god. You've got 3 broad types: historical poneglyphs that talk about events and apologies, instructional ones that point you toward weapons or other stones, and the road poneglyphs that literally form the endgame GPS. Simple system on paper, absolute mess in execution. Because where are they? Oh, just in supernormal places like the bottom of the sea in Fishman Island under a dragon-guarded palace, buried under a desert kingdom's forbidden ruins in Alabasta, wedged into a sky island that requires either a miracle knock-up stream or a death wish, and of course scattered through Wano, which is a closed-border death bowl with volcanoes and Kaido. It's like Oda made a list of where would you almost die, and then said, "Cool, that's the syllabus." And to be fair, a lot of the people guarding these stones are not proud curators. They're victims chained to a story they don't even fully know. The Shandians lost their homeland, got yeeted into the sky, and then spent 400 years bleeding over a stone they can't read. The fishmen are oppressed, trafficked, and stuck protecting a message from the same surface world that enslaves them. Wano's samurai are literally starved isolationists whose one job is to sit on the world's biggest spoiler. I want to emphasize, these aren't neutral librarians. They're collateral damage hired as security. Some stones are hidden in plain sight, which is almost funnier. Alabasta's poneglyph is just chilling in a basement like a shameful family secret. Skypia's is in crumbling ruins with gold D. Roger's graffiti on it like, "Roger was here, LOL." But then you have road poneglyphs on Zoo's walking elephant, in Big Mom's fortress, in Kaido's fortress, and presumably in some other nightmare location. You don't even get to see half of them without Yonko-adjacent power. The text is basically subtitled, "If you can read this, you are already a problem." So the network stops feeling like a static archive and starts looking like a stress test. It's not just, "Please remember us." It's, "Prove you deserve to remember us." Can you unite sky people and desert royalty, fishmen and samurai, minks and pirates, without turning into the next tyrant? Can you survive the world's worst hazards and still choose liberation over domination? People say, "Oh, it's just a treasure hunt." To which I say, mate, your treasure hunt doesn't usually require overthrowing multiple governments. And if the stones are the lock, then the person who can read them is the key. Which brings us back to a certain archaeologist and why the world government treats one woman like an extinction-level event. The Will of D, Bloodlines, Curses, or Revolutionary Software Update? Which brings us back to a certain archaeologist and why the world government treats one woman like an extinction-level event. Because as far as they're concerned, Robin is not just Robin. She's Robin plus a certain middle initial. And that little floating D has broken the fandom's brain harder than any power system chart ever could. Let's lay out the usual suspects. Gold D. Roger, the man who literally kicked off the Great Pirate Era. Monkey D. Garp, who spent his career almost accidentally protecting the future Pirate King. Monkey D. Dragon, the world's most wanted revolutionary. Monkey D. Luffy, joy incarnate with a body count of toppled regimes. Trafalgar D. Waterlaw, walking trauma surgeon. Marshall D. Teach, the universe's greasiest black hole. Jaguar D. Saul, the gentle giant who smiled while an island burned. Different vibes, same pattern. These people do not sit still while history happens. They walk into world-shaking events like they missed the "Do Not Enter" sign. And here's an interesting thing. Their relationship with death is weird. Roger smiles on the scaffold. Saul laughs as he freezes. Luffy nearly dies like 3 times a saga and comes back stronger. Teach literally tanks life-ending damage as a hobby. The story keeps framing D's as people who don't just face death, They kind of negotiate with it. In universe, everyone's noticed, they just refuse to explain it to us. Corazon whispers to Law that people with the D are the natural enemies of God, and then dies before elaborating, which is honestly rude. Sengoku treats the D like a classified file extension, tracking it across eras. Robin hears about the Will of D on Ohara, and then again on Skypiea and in Dressrosa, always as this half-remembered curse/promise hybrid. The world government clearly knows enough to be terrified, but not enough to give us a clean PowerPoint. So what is it? The classic theory is the bloodline model, D as the surname of an ancient enemy clan who opposed the ancestors of the celestial dragons in the Void Century. That nicely explains the government paranoia, the inherited middle initial, the way Ds keep ending up at the epicenter of regime change. But then you get people like Law, whose D is hidden, or Teach, who feels like a cosmic glitch. And to be fair, the tidy secret royal family angle starts to wobble. Other people go ideological. D as a cultural inheritance, not a gene, but a story. Families passing down a rebellious philosophy, a refusal to bow to gods. That tracks with Garp raising Dragon and Luffy, or Saul protecting O'Hara's books. The problem is, we also see Ds who don't share upbringing or ideology and still radiate that same chaos, which leads to the wild patch. D as something the world itself flags, almost like the planets running a revolutionary software update, and occasionally stamps a D on people who will crash the current system. It sounds insane, to which I say, this is a setting where the C literally has a mood disorder. I want to emphasize how deliberately incomplete this all is. Every new D reveal just adds another edge to the silhouette without filling in the middle. It's the ultimate iceberg hook. We can clearly see that the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, and the D are one giant knot. But every answer spawns two new questions, and if the middle initial is the world's glitchy warning label, then the next layer down is asking, what exactly broke the world in the first place? Joy Boy's broken promise, the ancient failure, haunting every arc. What broke the world isn't a weapon or a country. It's a guy writing an apology letter on a rock and then ghosting for 800 years. Joy Boy is basically the universe's worst group project partner, and the grade he failed is still dragging everyone else down. So, let's track the receipts. Our first explicit hit is Fishman Island, that poneglyph where Joy Boy literally says, "My bad," to Poseidon. It's not a prophecy, not a threat, just a carved apology to a princess he promised something huge. You pair that with the Noah, this absurdly massive forbidden ark parked above the island like a Chekhov's spaceship, and the Sea Kings whispering about the day of promised migration, and you start to see a pattern. Joy Boy isn't framed as a glorious hero. He's framed as a guy who messed up and feels bad about it. Then Wano comes in and quietly cranks the volume. The ancient drum beat, Zunesha hearing, "Joy Boy has returned," Kaido ranting about the man who will change the world, all while we're in a closed country that was deliberately sealed during the Void Century. Here's an interesting thing. Both Fishman Island and Wano are literally locked away by design, and both are directly tied to Joy Boy's name. As far as narrative neon signs go, that's just Oda screaming in bold italics. So what was the promise? On the surface level, it looks simple. Help fishmen go to the surface safely. End discrimination. Use Noah and Poseidon to guide everyone into a new era. But the Sea Kings talk about ships of the future and two sovereigns, and suddenly the scale explodes. We're not just talking about a bus pass to the red line. We're talking about rearranging the entire world, probably in tandem with the ancient weapons. Joy Boy's promise starts to look like a full system reset of the planet. And he failed. That failure is not ancient history, it's active infrastructure. Fishmen are still trapped under the red line. Noah is still sealed and unusable. The red line itself still divides species like a giant geological caste system. Every time we see fishman discrimination, every time Otohimi's dream gets dismissed as naive, that's Joy Boy's broken promise, replaying as a daily bug report the world refuses to fix. I want to emphasize how brutally consistent this is. The world government's propaganda, celestial dragons keeping slaves, entire races shoved into corners of the map, all feel like patches slapped over a feature Joy Boy tried to implement and couldn't. People say Joy Boy is just a legend, to which I say, legends don't leave physical to-do lists on indestructible stone. This is an unresolved ticket in the world's codebase, and to be fair, that's what makes Luffy's role terrifying, because as far as we can tell, someone has to actually finish this migration update, which is why Joy Boy is the pivot point of the whole iceberg. Who he was, why he failed, and who inherits that will, is the decoder ring for the Void Century, the ancient kingdom, even what One Piece structurally is. Was the treasure the tool to fulfill the promise, or the reward for doing it? If Joy Boy couldn't pull the trigger, what was he afraid of breaking? Because the next layer down is where we start asking, what if completing Joy Boy's promise means literally destroying the world as everyone knows it? From meme to map, how the One Piece Iceberg took over lore discourse. And this is exactly where the iceberg stops being just a cute diagram and starts acting like a weapon, because as far as the fandom is concerned, once you say, what if completing Joy Boy's promise destroys the world, you have officially unlocked the need for a chart telling us how deep into insanity we currently are. Iceberg charts didn't even start with One Piece. They floated over from creepypasta, conspiracy, and horror fandoms, surface tier, Slenderman, Abyss, the lost VHS tape your cousin swears he saw once at 3 a.m. Then gaming and anime picked it up as a way to sort what's common knowledge versus what only 3 people on a forum in 2009 remember. One Piece fans saw that and went, obviously, oh cool, a system for categorizing our collective brain damage. The first big One Piece icebergs were a mess in the funniest way. 16 random tiers, no consistent naming, East Blue stuff sitting right next to Luffy is a time god, and Oda confirmed this in a dream. People would slap SBS answers, fake leaks, meme theories, and actual deep cuts like obscure Vivre card islands into the same layer with zero quality control. You'd have a legitimate Void Century hint sitting under Zoro is a cactus, and nobody clarified which was the joke. And, to be fair, that chaos was part of the charm. Here's an interesting thing. Over time, people got weirdly serious about it. Later creators started standardizing tiers: surface, mid, deep, abyss. They added citations, chapter numbers, SBS volumes, Vivre card pages. Suddenly, the iceberg wasn't just a meme, it was a semi-scholarly index of trivia, contradictions, and metalore. Unnamed island from that one cover story, labeled Prototype Devil Fruit from a Romance Dawn Draft, logged. It became the poor man's database for a 1,000-chapter world that keeps changing the map. This video is basically us role-playing that evolution in real time. We start with obvious stuff, the surface tier, hockey. devil fruits, basic void century questions. Then we let it slide into the mid and deep layers, where you get Dark Universe futures and Helmeppo's entire moral glow-up. By the time we're in the abyss, we're talking about Joy Boy as a failed world destroyer and treating the iceberg as a narrative spine, not just a static list we read off like a grocery receipt. The format also hacks your brain. You pause, Google a term, fall down a rabbit hole of some SBS about a background character who secretly fought in a war we've never seen, and suddenly you're writing your own iceberg in the comments. The community keeps crowdsourcing deeper layers. Every rewatch adds another tiny detail Oda buried in the margins, to which I say that's the real appeal of One Piece meta, discovering how much power lives in the throwaway lines. And I want to emphasize, it's not just a race to the darkest, edgiest theory, it's a coping mechanism. As the manga passes 1,000 chapters, the iceberg helps us remember what's canon, what's fanon, and what was a joke someone made once that accidentally became a religion. But the iceberg is also a mirror. What we choose to bury in the lowest tiers says a lot about what we're actually afraid of or obsessed with, which is where we head next. The psychology of why we keep diving down. Why we crave the abyss, the psychology of obscure One Piece lore. So here's the spicy take. The deeper you go on a One Piece iceberg, the less it's about One Piece and the more it's about us. The Abyss tier is basically a fandom Rorschach test. You stare at one weird panel of a crying background kid and decide it's secret God Valley trauma. And to which I say, congratulations, you've just psychoanalyzed yourself using a pirate comic. Because as far as psychological hooks go, the iceberg is cracked in 3 very specific ways. First is completionism. We are all that guy who can't leave a single island unexplored on the map screen. If Oda mentions a lost island once in an SBS or a Vivre card, suddenly you feel physically compelled to know its climate, its exports, and which Revolutionary Army intern passed through there. Second is pattern seeking. One panel of a weird scar, one throwaway line in a data book, and now we're drawing red strings between a cover story seagull and the void century. Third is narrative hunger. Oda deliberately leaves blanks, and our brains cannot stand a blank, so we start writing fan scripts in our heads. Here's an interesting thing. The structure of One Piece is basically a training regimen for this behavior. Off-screen events like the God Valley incident, time skips where everyone comes back with suspicious new scars, cover story side plots that quietly introduce entire kingdoms, and those tiny data book scraps that say, this guy once met a certain famous pirate. That's Oda grabbing us by the collar and whispering, every background detail might secretly matter. And to be fair, sometimes it actually does, which just makes the addiction worse. But some of the darkest iceberg entries are built on almost nothing. A single SBS joke about a character's true face, a map inconsistency where an island existed for exactly one panel and then vanished, an early romance dawn draft where a straw hat was supposed to die in East Blue. These are the vaguest, flimsiest ideas, and that's exactly why they're so sticky. When there's no canon answer, the theory has infinite power. Your brain keeps poking it at 3 a.m. like, what if Oda really meant it, though? Then you get the appeal of forbidden knowledge, the sense that you and your tiny Discord server know the real One Piece, the dark meta-lore under the surface. You're not just reading the manga. You're decoding Oda's handwritten notes from 1997. Does it matter that the text will probably never fully confirm your theory about that background revolutionary we saw once? Not really. The thrill is in feeling like part of a smaller, smarter group. I want to emphasize, this can go way too far. Fake leaks, mistranslated SBS lines, a joke tweet that gets screenshotted, slapped on an iceberg chart, repeated in 10 TikTok breakdowns, and suddenly it's common knowledge that Oda confirmed X in a secret interview. Fanon calcifies into fact because we repeat it, not because it's real. We are literally speedrunning our own misinformation. And the way we're pacing this video, jumping from canon to meta to pure speculation, is deliberately mimicking that rabbit hole high. We are, very lovingly, weaponizing your iceberg brain for retention. The real question is, what happens when canon actually answers some of these Abyss Tier mysteries? When we hit Laugh Tale, does the iceberg finally collapse? Or does it just shift and reveal something even weirder underneath? That's where we're headed next. When canon strikes back, how new chapters rewrite the iceberg. So here's the twist. Canon doesn't kill the iceberg. Canon is the reason the iceberg keeps respawning like some cursed Logia. Every time Oda drops a lore bomb, O'Hara flashbacks, Reverie God Valley, Egghead Science TED Talk, you'd think half the chart gets deleted. To which I say, have you met this fandom? We just shove the debris deeper or sideways and call it a new tier. Here's an interesting thing. A bunch of stuff that used to live in You Only Know This if you've read 6 fan translations and a 2006 forum thread territory is now front and center Shonen Jump material. Rox D. Zebek was once this vague boogeyman name buried in data books and old theories. Now he's literally a central pillar of the world's power system. God Valley used to be a cursed map scribble, and now it's a whole historical trauma event that keeps getting teased. Imu went from maybe the Gorosei report to some shadow figure to, oh cool, eldritch stick figure king just sat on the empty throne on panel. Ancient weapons, those were myth tier. Now Poseidon is a character, Pluton is parked under Wano, and Egghead is casually explaining Uranus mechanics in the background, because as far as the iceberg is concerned, that creates a moving target. Yesterday's crack theory is today's accepted wiki entry, and the second it gets confirmed, the real sickos immediately pivot. Okay, Rox existed. What did his crew actually want? Okay, Imu is real. What even are they? Human? Weapon? Something in between? The new questions sink straight to the Abyss tiers, while the old mystery floats up to the kiddie pool. And Oda absolutely plays into this cycle on purpose. He'll answer one question while quietly raising 3 more in the same chapter, like it's a buy 1 get 3 free sale on confusion. O'Hara gives us Void Century hints, but also dumps the Will of D, the Ancient Kingdom logo, and that one giant straw hat. Reverie shows us Imu, then immediately cuts away so we can fight each other for 5 years. That's just how you sustain 25-plus years of hype without your story collapsing under its own lore mess. Meanwhile, iceberg chart makers are running a full-time metagame. Every new chapter, people sprint to add panels, reclassify entries, or split stuff into confirmed, deconfirmed, and still cursed but fun to believe. I want to emphasize how funny it is watching a theory about, say, Uranus go from laughed out of the server to mid-tier consensus to actually post-Egghead. This is basically canon adjacent. Some fan-favorite theories survive by mutating. Void Century ideas that used to hinge on specific characters. Joy Boy is Luffy's dad's hat's ghost or whatever. Shift toward broader mechanisms. Inherited wills. Cyclical history. D as a social movement instead of a bloodline. The theory doesn't die. It just molts. And to be fair, the more canon we get, the more valuable the truly obscure sources become. Old databooks, half-forgotten SBS answers, prototype romance dawn drafts, those are the last untouched mystery fuel mines. When the manga hands you Emu, the only way to get deeper is to dig into some 1999 interview where Oda vaguely joked about a king above kings. So the iceberg stops being a static graphic and turns into an ongoing argument. What even counts as deep now? Who gets to decide when something graduates up a tier? That tug-of-war over placement, over what's allowed on the chart at all, that's where the community collaboration and the petty little lore wars really kick in next. Fandom as co-author? Who decides what's real on the iceberg? And here's the spicy part. If you learned any cursed little One Piece fact from an iceberg chart, a YouTube video like this, or some Twitter thread with 40 screenshots, you've already joined a tiny translation committee you did not vote for. We are all outsourcing our understanding of canon to like 4 guys with Photoshop and a Dropbox full of raws. Because as far as One Piece information goes, the language barrier is the real final boss. Early scanlations were a mess. Ambition, spirit, hockey, all thrown around like darts. SBS jokes got flattened into fake-sounding rules. Region-specific databooks dropped a line about some background Marine's hometown, but only in the French edition. So you end up with 3 versions of the truth, and whichever one hit your timeline first becomes your personal canon. Here's an interesting thing. Iceberg makers are basically the editors-in-chief of this chaos. They decide that a one-off SBS gag about a character's underwear is shallow tier, but a vague comment about a king above kings goes in the abyss with ominous lighting. They'll label a half-baked theory as mystery, quietly exile debunked stuff to the bottom corner, and just never mention the trivia they personally find boring. If it's not on the chart, for a lot of viewers, it might as well not exist. Then you have the big theory channels and wiki editors who are like the amplification system. Once a claim gets a dedicated video thumbnail or its own wiki page, it feels real. Suddenly, that offhand Oda joke about a straw hat dying in East Blue is being treated like a grim secret roadmap. An SBS where Oda is clearly clowning becomes a soft confirmation of void century details. And to be fair, we do this too. We're all chasing patterns, even when the source is literally a doodle in the corner of a data book. Some of the most viral, deep-tier entries aren't even in-story facts, they're meta-trivia. Early romance dawn drafts with different devil fruits. Rejected character designs, that one island that existed for a single panel in an old map and then quietly vanished. Timeline weirdness, where a cover story location gets a name only in a Vivre card. These live in that gray zone between canon and behind the scenes, and the iceberg treats them like ghost stories. Every now and then, fandom consensus has to be walked back. A mistranslated SBS about hockey limitations, an old scan that made a joke sound serious, a secret detail that later gets contradicted in a volume note. People will say, the iceberg lied, to which I say, the iceberg is not a Bible, it's a group chat screenshot. It's messy, it's half correct, and it's constantly being edited by whoever yells last. I want to emphasize that this is actually kind of great, because if the iceberg is a negotiated document, that means you're not just a consumer, you're a co-author. You get to question tiers, argue sources, propose your own entries. And if we're all co-writing this sprawling half-canon atlas of weird One Piece lore, the real fun question isn't just what's true, it's what we do with it. Do we stop at watching charts? Or do we start using this obsession as fuel for fan comics, AUS games, whole new creative projects built out of the abyss we just mapped, turning lore into fuel, using the iceberg to enjoy One Piece more? So let's actually weaponize this, because if the iceberg is just 2 hours of us pointing at charts going, "Whoa, spooky, that's fun," but it's also kind of a waste of how powerful this way of thinking is. I want to emphasize, the iceberg is not a trivia exam. You are not being graded on whether you remember the one SBS where Oda offhandedly mentions a guy who fought in a war we've never seen. Think of it as a toolkit. It's brain training. You're teaching yourself to notice patterns, gaps, and callbacks, instead of just letting the episodes wash over you like seawater and snack crumbs. So, what does that look like in practice? Try rewatching early arcs with a void century lens on. Every time someone says blank century, ancient kingdom, or that incident 20 years ago, and pause and ask, is this about the same crime or a different one? When Crocus casually mentions a certain pirate era at Reverse Mountain, when Robin reacts a little too hard to some random poneglyph, clock it. You're basically speedrunning being a Clover-level historian without the execution part. Here's an interesting thing. Establishing shots are secretly endgame content. Next time you're in Logtown, Jaya, Sabaody, just pause on the crowd. That background Marine with the weird scar? Check if he shows up in a Vivre card later. That one ship in the harbor? It might get a named captain in a databook 5 years down the line. As far as payoff density goes, One Piece is absurdly generous to people who remember tiny, stupid details, which is why we recommend keeping a dumb little note somewhere. Nothing fancy. A Google Doc titled Weird One Piece Stuff, or a Notes app list like Mysterious Scars / Missing Islands / Guys Who Know Too Much. Anytime you see a cover story island that never gets named in the manga, or a line that feels off, jot it down. 6 arcs later, when Oda casually connects it, you get that galaxy brain, "Oh my God, I knew it" moment, instead of, "Wait, who is this again?" And don't sleep on the official extras. SBS, Vivre cards, databooks. Treat them as mini icebergs. Don't just skim for answers. Look for contradictions, weird phrasing, or details that feel too specific. Why does a Vivre card mention a character's first execution? First implies second. Why does a databook map an island that never appears on panel? That's iceberg fuel. Then you turn that fuel into output, fan art of the Full God Valley incident, fanfic that actually sits with the implied atrocities Oda can't show in Jump, custom icebergs that only cover devil fruits, or just marines, or just geography that doesn't add up. Suddenly, you're not just consuming the lore mess, you're remixing it. And to be fair, you don't have to touch every layer. Some deep-tier stuff is more disturbing than fun, and Oda clearly doesn't want every implication spelled out. If a theory or an SBS answer makes the story worse for you, throw it overboard. Curate your own iceberg. The point is, the best way to keep this whole thing alive is to keep adding to it. Spot new patterns, challenge old entries, bring your weirdest finds into theory discords, subreddit megathreads, comment sections where people actually post panels instead of just vibes. Because as far as communal brain rot goes, the iceberg only works if we all keep digging. And in the next part, we're going to push that even further and talk about what happens when the story itself starts reacting to us. Surfacing from the depths, recapping the wildest layers we just crossed. So let's actually come up for air for a second and look at the trench we just swam through. Because as far as iceberg dives go, this one started way up in the kiddie pool and ended in please close the tab and touch grass territory. We opened with the surface stuff, East Blue feeling simple and cozy, but already full of weird hairline fractures. Romance Dawn prototypes, where Luffy has completely different powers. Draft Zoros with guns. Gaimon-style gag islands that quietly vanish. Those early ambition lines, the vague talk of will, the maps that don't quite match later globes. All the little details Oda either retconned, buried, or recycled into something else, quietly whispering that this world was always stranger than the anime's bright Saturday morning tone would admit. Then we kept sinking, and the water got ugly. Erased islands that exist for exactly one panel, and then never again. Buster Call-like craters with no official name, just implied mass graves. Cipher pole ghosts doing black ops in the background while we're focused on Luffy punching a clown. Forgotten prisons and labor camps that only show up in a cover story caption or a vivre card note. Off-screen genocides, kid trafficking routes, kingdoms wiped from history between chapters. It's the part of One Piece where you realize the real horror is not what we see, it's what Oda deliberately cuts around. And here's an interesting thing. A lot of the scariest pieces never made it into the manga at all. They live in interviews, SBS answers, data books, even layout choices. Oda saying, "Yeah, that island was destroyed," or "I almost killed this straw hat in East Blue," and then just moving on. Panel compositions that hide a celestial dragon brand in the corner. Timelines that only line up if you assume an unseen war. The real iceberg is the stuff he almost put in but didn't, to which I say, we are willingly obsessing over deleted scenes from a comic about a rubber man. Somewhere along the way, the meme chart stopped being a joke and turned into a filing system for that obsession. Fans started pinning everything on it. Legit SBS trivia, half-canon vivre card stats, and also completely feral theories about background Marines who must be ex-Rocks pirates because their sideburns look evil. It's a mess, but it's a functional mess, a crowdsourced map of what this story makes our brains do. I want to emphasize the psychological part, too. Why are we magnetically drawn to the deepest, vaguest tiers? Because they promise patterns. They let us feel like we're wrestling with the same negative space Oda plays in. The darkness is part of it, sure, but the real high is thinking, wait, did he plan this? And knowing the honest answer is probably kind of. And to be fair, that's way more fun than a perfectly clean, over-explained power system, and this whole thing is moving under our feet. New chapters promote old entries. Fan translators demote others, and every time Oda drops a throwaway line, some poor soul has to redraw their entire chart. The iceberg isn't a monument, it's a living document of us trying to keep up. So, if we had to compress the thesis into one punchy line, it's this. One Piece isn't just long, it's layered, and the real fun is realizing how much of the story lives in the negative space. The gaps the iceberg tries to outline. Next, we're going to cash that out. If you've made it this far into the abyss, the final section is where we lay out exactly what you can do to stay in the loop, keep exploring, and maybe even help rewrite the iceberg yourself. Your next dive, how to keep exploring the One Piece iceberg. So, the bad news is you are now officially too deep. You cannot go back to watching One Piece like it's just funny rubber man punches bad guy ever again. The good news is, why would you want to? You've seen erased islands, secret prisons, and government gaslighting on a geopolitical scale. Saturday anime nights are permanently upgraded. And here's an interesting thing. If you enjoyed being mildly psychologically damaged by this iceberg, this is literally what we do all the time. Subscribing isn't just support the channel. It's basically you getting a permanent Vivre card to more long-form dives into SBS oddities, cover story conspiracies, geography that doesn't add up, and whatever fresh mess Canon drops next week that forces us to redraw half this chart. We're talking the stuff that lives between panels. The East Blue retcons Oda quietly buried. The Romance Dawn prototypes where Luffy had a completely different power. The islands that only exist in a Vivre card and one blurry map shot. If that sounds like the kind of system your brain unfortunately runs on now, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, do the whole ritual, because as far as deep lore goes, we are absolutely not done. I want to emphasize, I need to know which part of this thing actually messed with you the most. Was it the Dark Universe futures? The crowd-shot background character with a canon war backstory? The implied black sites under Impel Down? Drop it in the comments, and then tell me which hyper-specific, obscure topic you want a full breakdown on next. SBS 47, Question 3, Level Specific. If you give me a panel number, I will probably lose an entire weekend to it. Also, you have that one friend who keeps saying, it's just a goofy pirate show, right? To which I say, no. Send them this video, time-stamped directly to the Erased Islands and Secret Prisons. Weaponize the iceberg. If they come back, still calling it goofy, that's on them. If you want the next layer down right now, your concrete next watch is waiting. We've got Void Century breakdowns that stitch together every vague hint from O'Hara to Egghead, an East Blue retcon tour where we catalog all the early weirdness Oda quietly patched, and an Impel Down theory dive that treats the prison like a horror setting the story is too scared to show us straight. Pick one. Let autoplay drag you further into the abyss. And to be fair, you don't have to memorize any of this. You don't need a 4D mind map. Just grab one weird detail that stuck with you and follow that thread. That's how every great One Piece theory starts. Because as far as lore journeys go, they're all just one panel at a time. Last thing, help build the next iceberg. If you've got a cursed SBS quote, an interview link, a panel everyone forgets, throw it in the comments. Future videos are absolutely going to feature viewer-submitted mysteries. We've surfaced for now, but the map's only getting bigger. So hit subscribe, grab your Vivre card, and I'll see you on the next descent.